Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're lying in bed tracing the quiet contours of thought, walking a midnight street beneath sodium lamps, or just filling silence on a long, slow drive, this space is for you, because tonight we journey into the deep past to explore the first human art, the mystery of 30,000-year-old cave paintings. This is contemplative storytelling for ancient questions and tired minds. This is the untold story of the first images ever made, a moment frozen in limestone, a time when breath and pigment met stone in the dark, and silence became memory. But it is not a story of museums or masterpieces. It begins not with genius, but with a hand pressed to stone and left behind. Oh, and if you're someone who cherishes calm ideas, quiet wonder, and science that feels like myth, just look below the video. You'll see a button that says subscribe. Tap it if you'd like. You can unsubscribe any time, and the little bell next to it will quietly tell you when a new story arrives. Subscribing really does help. This channel depends on your support to keep making videos like this. Also, where are you listening from right now? What time is it for you? If you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments. It's a quiet reminder that we're all here, together, across time zones and timelines. And, if you fall asleep, that's okay too. There are timestamps in the description to help you find your place later. Now, let's begin, with a hand in the dark. In the deep hush of ancient stone beneath layers of calcite and time, a red ochre handprint clings to a cave wall, a palm pressed flat, fingers splayed in silence. It is not signed. It carries no message, no name, no date. And yet it speaks. This is where we begin, because this is the first painter. 30,000 years ago or more, in the velvet dark of a hidden chamber, someone raised their hand, dipped pigment in breath, and marked the world with themselves. Not to hunt, not to survive, but to be remembered. And in doing so, they crossed a threshold, one no other creature on earth has crossed. The act of painting was not about need, it was about meaning. What must it have felt like to become an image? The mystery of ancient cave art begins not in the details of style or technique, but in the very fact of its existence. These were not idle doodles in the sand. These were not marks scratched by accident. They were placed deliberately, often deep within cave systems where no light could reach, far from the rhythms of ordinary life. Over 20,000 years before the first city rose, before agriculture, before writing or wheels or kings, there was this, the outline of a human hand, the painted gallop of a horse, the careful rendering of a bison's muscle frozen in mid-stride. What moved someone, alone or not, we will never know, to crawl into the stone belly of the earth and begin to paint? Across Europe and parts of Asia, this mystery reappears like an echo. In the caves of Chauvet, in southern France, the walls ripple with movement, lions stalking, rhinos clashing horns, horses rearing with windless grace. Carbon dating tells us some of these scenes were painted over 34,000 years ago, yet they possess perspective, motion, layering, techniques rediscovered only in the Renaissance. Is it possible that a mind so ancient could also be so modern? Or have we underestimated the architecture of the earliest imagination? Further north, in the famous caves of Lascaux, discovered in the shadow of war in the year 1940, the ceiling itself becomes a gallery. Over 600 paintings span the walls, oxen, deer, ibex, bulls, rendered with colour and curve and spirit. It is not a zoo. It is a vision. The artist here saw through the animal, beyond it, into something we struggle still to name. Was it worship? Was it a memory? Was it the first theatre of light and shadow? And far from Europe, on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, in a cave known as Liang Tedongi, another handprint blooms in crimson. Nearby, a wild pig, the oldest known image of any animal drawn by human hand, stands beneath a rocky overhang, drawn with precision and intent. This painting is at least 45,000 years old. In its simplicity, it rivals everything else we've seen. Different continent, same hand, different species of flora and fauna, same impulse. How can that be? What lives inside us that longs to leave a mark? It is one thing to survive, to hunt and eat and hide from the cold. It is another entirely to conjure the invisible into form, to transform breath and dust into permanence. These paintings were not made for the eye of the passerby. Many of them lie hundreds of meters deep inside labyrinthine cave systems. There is no sunlight here, only torchlight, flickering and uncertain, casting shadows that dance across the contours of rock and time. What kind of mind imagines not just the image, but the performance of it? The wall becomes a stage. The animals move when the firelight moves. The caves breathe when you breathe. Is this not art in its purest sense, something made to be experienced in ritual, in darkness, in reverence? The handprints too are not signatures of ego, but silhouettes of presence. Most are created by a technique called negative stenciling, placing the hand against the rock and blowing pigment around it, often red ochre or black manganese. The result is the absence of colour where the hand was, a ghost, a self-shaped void. Some caves hold dozens, even hundreds of these prints. Small hands, large hands, some missing fingers, some layered one atop the other. Were they declarations? Were they prayers? Or were they the oldest form of saying, "I was here"? In the cave of El Castillo in Spain, a red disc painted on the wall has been dated to at least 40,800 years ago. Nearby, hand stencils press outward from the stone, their age just as ancient. This pushes the timeline back even further. It suggests that these early artists may not have even been modern Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals. If so, then the urge to create is not just human. It is hominin. It predates language as we know it. It reaches deeper than culture. It is a fire older than words. What kind of consciousness leaves behind symbols it knows it will never see again? There is something heartbreakingly generous in that gesture, to paint something for others you will never meet. To carve a symbol for eyes that have not yet opened. It is not the act of a beast. It is not the instinct of a survivor. It is the quiet ambition of a mind that knows it is not eternal, and paints anyway. Every figure, every silhouette is an admission. We are fleeting, but we can mark time. We can place memory in stone, and perhaps this is why these galleries feel so sacred, so still. Not because they were built as temples, but because they are already tombs, not tombs of bodies, but of moments. Each image is a fossil of thought, a flash of interior life made external, and in that way these caves are not just places, they are messages, from one mind to another, across tens of thousands of years. What does it mean to be understood by someone who has turned to dust? In these painted caverns, the boundary between present and past dissolves. You're not simply looking at art. You're looking with someone standing where they stood, seeing what they saw, guided by their gestures across a darkness that once echoed with torchlight and breath. The wall becomes a shared surface of consciousness. Across this impossible gulf of time, a conversation begins, not with language, but with presence, not with words, but with forms that bypass the tongue and go directly to the pulse. How often does history offer not just an artifact, but a voice? And it is here, in this long silence, that we begin to understand the true mystery of Paleolithic art. These are not survival tools. These are not maps or traps. These are acts of internal life turned outward. They tell us that by 30,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier, humans were capable of abstraction, of imagination, of symbolic thinking. These are not merely clever animals. These are storytellers, dreamers, philosophers in skins and ash. They could see more than what was in front of them. They could see what wasn't, and then make it real. What else could art possibly be? In Chauvet, certain animals appear in groups, in motion, their legs overlapping in ways that suggest running or chasing. The artist understood something critical about representation. Time can be collapsed into a single frame. Action can be stilled without losing its energy. The cave becomes a canvas, yes, but also a memory. A place where the past could be replayed. This is the root of all narrative, the moment when reality could be bent into story. How did they learn this? Who taught them? It is a question without answer. There are no schools, no apprenticeships that we know of. Yet the precision of the lines, the harmony of colour, the use of the wall's natural contours to suggest movement or volume, all of it points to a visual intelligence so refined it defies the label primitive. Indeed, that word collapses in the face of such evidence. What survives is not crude, it is careful, it is aware. It is perhaps more honest than anything we make today, because it was made with no expectation of being seen. It was made because it had to be made. What kind of world creates art before agriculture? Imagine the priorities of such a people. Before there were farms, there was pigment. Before there were written contracts, there were silhouettes of hands. Before there was architecture, there were caves made sacred by human attention. These early artists lived in a world ruled by ice and megafauna, by danger and scarcity. And yet they found, or created, space for beauty. Not decorative beauty, not utilitarian beauty, but the kind of beauty that asks nothing in return. What part of us needs to bring beauty into a world that offers so little of it freely? Perhaps it is the part that aches in silence, the part that recognizes impermanence not as tragedy, but as a canvas, the part that knows survival is not enough. To be alive is one thing. To be human is to reach beyond that, into the intangible, into meaning. And meaning, unlike food or fire, cannot be held in the hand. It must be conjured, shared, left behind. These cave walls are full of meaning, but they do not explain themselves. There are no captions, no instructions, no myths written into the stone. And yet, somehow we understand. Not in language, but in sensation. A horse rearing in ochre, its head lifted in motion. A lioness prowling in profile, almost breathing in the flicker of torchlight. A spiral of handprints stretching across a limestone chamber, like a chorus of silent witnesses. There is no Rosetta Stone here, but there is recognition. Intimate, unspoken recognition. What does it say about us that we can read this, even now? In Sulawesi, the art appears as if from another world, and yet its spirit is the same, a handprint, an animal. The geometry of experience transformed into pigment. The distance between these sites, thousands of kilometers, entire continents, suggests something astonishing. Not just isolated genius, but a shared instinct, a pattern, a longing. Could it be that symbolic thought emerged not in one place, but in many? Could it be that this was not an invention, but an emergence? Not a spark, but a tide rising in the collective mind of our species? And if that is true, then what awakens that tide? Some suggest that cave art began as a form of ritual, a way to summon animals or spirits or protection. Perhaps it did. But to stop there is to miss the deeper resonance. Ritual is not the opposite of art. Ritual is art performed with intent, repeated with care, carved into rhythm. And these paintings carry that rhythm. You can feel it in the layering of pigment, the return to the same walls over generations, the careful selection of surfaces where rock itself becomes part of the image. These were not random acts. They were rehearsed, revisited, remembered. Who were they remembering? Maybe no one. Or maybe everyone. Maybe these were not depictions, but thresholds. Doorways between seen and unseen, body and spirit, self and world. The bison was not just a bison. The hand was not just a hand. They were stand-ins, symbols, tools to speak across dimensions of time and being. What is a symbol, after all, but a thing that holds more than its shape? And yet, what breaks the heart most is not what they painted, but what they didn't. Because in these vast galleries of animals and abstractions, of movement and shadow, one thing is largely absent: us. The human figure appears rarely, if at all. And when it does, it is strange, masked, fragmented, twisted into half beast, half man, as if the artist could depict the mammoth in motion, the lion in silence, but not themselves. As if the human form was too dangerous, too sacred, too unknowable to draw clearly. Why did we hesitate to depict our own face? Some suggest it was taboo. Others say it was a reflection of spiritual belief, or fear of misrepresentation. But whatever the reason, the result is striking. In this earliest art, we do not place ourselves at the centre. We orbit the world instead, humbled and peripheral. Surrounded by creatures of power and mystery, we do not dominate. We observe. We reflect. We haunt the edges of our own vision. Is that humility? Or is it awe? Either way, the absence of the human body throws the presence of the human mind into sharp relief. Because what we do see everywhere is intention, pattern, composition, the understanding that space has meaning, that some surfaces matter more than others, that repetition is memory, that silence is part of the image. These are not the instincts of a creature acting on impulse. These are the choices of an artist, a mind arranging the world from the inside out. So what, then, is this art evidence of? Not simply culture, not even creativity. It is evidence of consciousness, of an interior life so rich it overflowed into the dark, carving breath into stone. These caves are not archives, they are testimonies, whispers from those who lived and died before history began, telling us something in a language older than words. We saw, we felt, we imagined, and in that moment they became us. Because to be human is not just to survive, it is to remember. To paint is to create memory where there was none, to record, to resist the forgetfulness of time. These artists may not have known us, but they knew of us, not personally, but conceptually. They knew there would be others, later, someone to see the mark, someone to touch the stone, someone to ask, who made this? And so they left the answer in Pigment, a hand. That most human of symbols, a boundary between body and world, a tool for creation and destruction, a vessel of touch and distance. But here, it is neither weapon nor tool. It is presence. It is saying, I existed. I reached into the future. And now you are touching what I touched. What is time, if not that? So we stand in these caves, Chauvet, Lascaux, Sulawesi, not as tourists, but as inheritors. And the hand on the wall becomes a mirror, the bison becomes a story, the silence becomes a voice, and the stone at last begins to speak. But what kind of voice chooses to speak only from the depths of darkness? It is one thing to paint beneath the open sky, to carve symbols into sunlit rock or scratch figures into sand. It is another entirely to take a burning torch, a pouch of pigment, and descend into the belly of the earth, to crawl through narrow limestone corridors, through tunnels so tight the breath catches, and enter chambers where not even moonlight has ever fallen. There, in the still and airless dark, a fire is lit. A wall is chosen, and something unseen is made visible. The first galleries of human art were not displayed, they were hidden, buried, sealed in stone and silence. Why? What pulls a mind into the dark to leave a mark that no one may ever see? This is the paradox of Paleolithic cave art. Its brilliance lies not just in its execution, but in its concealment. It resists the logic of visibility. It denies the instinct of audience. If these were made to be seen, why place them where seeing is nearly impossible? If they were messages, who were they for? What is it that grows stronger in darkness than in light? Perhaps the answer begins not in biology but in metaphor. The cave has always been more than stone. It is the womb of the earth, a threshold, a chamber of transformation. To enter it is to pass from the world of living bodies into a realm of shadows and memory. It is where vision begins to blur and the senses bend. Fire becomes the sun, smoke becomes breath. In this altered state, meaning begins to slip loose from its bindings. What is painted is no longer just representation, it is revelation. Could it be that the darkness was the point? To paint in these conditions required extraordinary effort. The torchlight was fleeting, the air thin, the heat suffocating, and yet someone or many returned again and again. In Chauvet, the presence of multiple layers of art suggests that paintings were revisited, retouched, even reimagined across generations. This was not graffiti, this was pilgrimage, and the cave was the shrine. Its walls were not blank slates but living surfaces, shaped by time and water, breathing with mineral patterns that seem almost to move as the flame dances. The artist did not impose upon the cave, they collaborated with it. What kind of reverence makes the earth a partner in creation? In Lascaux, evidence suggests that scaffolding was built to reach the tallest chambers. Pigment had to be ground, mixed, carried. The torches themselves had to be crafted, fed with resin and care. Every stroke of the brush, or the reed, or the fingers, was earned through sweat and risk, and all of it was done where no daylight could follow. So again we must ask, why? Why venture so far into the earth, into places that suffocate sound, into spaces that erase the horizon? Why risk fire, air, and time simply to place a pigment on stone? Perhaps it was not danger that drew them, but transformation. In the outer world, survival ruled. But in the inner world of the cave, where silence reigned, where shadows stretched long and fluid, another logic emerged. One not of tooth and claw, but of symbol and spirit. It is here that ritual may have found its earliest home. The cave, in its isolation, in its refusal of the ordinary, became a container for something sacred. Not sacred in the religious sense as we know it today, but in the primal sense, the separation of the mundane from the mysterious. What happens when we step away from the world of necessity and into the world of meaning? Archaeologists have long debated the purpose of this hidden art. Was it magic? A kind of sympathetic gesture toward the hunt, painted in hopes of ensuring success? The spear thrown with pigment before it was thrown in truth? Others suggest the caves were places of initiation, where youth were brought to encounter the spirits of the animal world and their place within it. And some believe they were temples of memory, where ancestors lived on in image and firelight. But perhaps there is no single answer. Perhaps the mystery is the point. Could it be that painting in the dark was itself the ritual? Consider what is required. A descent into danger, a preparation of materials, a focused intention, and then a transformation of raw space into something patterned, inhabited. This sequence, descent, preparation, creation, emergence, is the skeleton of ritual across all human culture. To go down into the earth and return with a new vision is to reenact the shape of myth itself. The artist becomes not merely a craftsman, but a guide, a dreamer, a midwife of symbols, and what of the figures themselves? In many caves, animals dominate the scene. Horses, mammoths, lions, ibex, deer. They move in clusters, in spirals, in dreamlike formations. They are not frozen, but flowing, as though the act of painting them summoned their motion. Rarely are they hunted. There is little violence. No spears pierce their flanks. Instead, they are rendered with grace, with respect, with something like awe. The lines curve lovingly around their flanks. Their eyes are often open, alert, watching. Were these images prayers then, or ancestors, or gods? In the darkness, with flame dancing on the walls and shadows rippling across the stone, it is not hard to imagine that these animals were not just seen, but felt. That they came alive not in pigment alone, but in presence. That the act of painting them was a kind of invocation, and the cave itself, a threshold between what is and what might be. What if these walls were never meant to display art, but to hold something? Not just image, but memory. Not just form, but presence. The cave, then, becomes not a gallery but a vessel, and the act of painting becomes not performance, but placement. Something being put into the world rather than shown. This is the difference between communication and communion. One seeks to transmit, the other to transform. What if the artists were not trying to say something, but to become something? In the flicker of firelight, the painted bison looms, the rearing horse trembles with imagined movement, and the human, always at the edges, watches, or perhaps merges. Some scholars propose that these deep cave rituals may have been shamanic in nature, that altered states, induced by darkness, repetition, fire or plant, allowed the mind to slip from its boundaries and cross into the world of the animal, the spirit, the unseen. And if that is true, then the cave is not just a location, it is a passage, a corridor between mind and myth. What does it mean to paint not as a human, but through one? In such a view, the figure who places hand to wall is not asserting identity, but dissolving it. The handprint becomes not I am, but I was touched. The animals become not decoration, but travellers, messengers moving between dimensions of meaning. And the darkness becomes not obstacle, but medium, because it is only in the absence of light that vision becomes internal. It is only in silence that symbols can emerge. Is this why the art is so alive? Because it is not born of the eye alone, but of the body, the breath, the trembling fire. In the modern world we separate art from ritual, image from spirit. But in the deep past there was no such division. The act of painting in darkness was not separate from living. It was an extension of it. The pigment came from the earth, the fire from trees, the wall from time itself, and the artist? A node in this web, a momentary aperture through which the whole might speak. And still we ask, was it meant for others? Were these acts private or public? Were they shared with tribe and clan, or performed alone in the most intimate stillness? The archaeological record cannot answer, but we can imagine a single figure descending with torch and ochre, a cluster of figures chanting softly as flame wavers, a child watching in wonder as the shape of a deer emerges from stone. Each possibility tells a different story, but each shares one thing: intention. Not random, not idle, but meaningful. What kind of mind returns to the dark, again and again, to speak in silence? This is where we feel the edge of our understanding. We are looking at something familiar yet alien, something intimate yet unreachable, like a dream half remembered at dawn. The images endure, but the thoughts behind them remain in shadow. And perhaps that shadow is not failure, but invitation. Perhaps the unknowability is the point. These works were not made to be explained. They were made to be experienced. They were made to be felt, and in that way they remain alive, not because we decode them, but because we stand before them and ask, why? Why here? Why this? Why now? Why does the act of creation so often require separation from the world? There is something timeless in that question. Even now the writer retreats to silence. The composer turns from noise. The painter finds the studio's quiet. To create is to carve space out of the ordinary. To step aside from the stream of action and enter a still pool of intention. And in the Paleolithic world, there was no greater stillness than the cave, no deeper quiet, no more complete absence of daylight, of chaos, of movement. It was a return to zero, to the untouched, to the origin. What might have stirred inside the mind in such a place? When the world above was uncertain, filled with hunger and cold, with animals both hunted and hunting, the descent into the earth was a crossing, not away from danger, but into meaning. Here the body slowed, the breath grew loud, the flame bent and sputtered, and then the first gesture, a hand to the wall, a mouth full of ochre, a breath expelled, a silhouette formed, not shouted, not spoken, breathed. What kind of story begins with breath and shadow? That first painted hand may not have been seen by others, it may never have been touched again, but its creation was enough. In it was the joining of intention and matter, of thought and world. That is art in its most elemental form, not performance but transformation, and the cave, the deep, cold dark, was the crucible. And so we return to the mystery of intention. Was this communication? Were these messages for others? Were they warnings, lessons, maps, or were they meditations, acts of contemplation with no receiver but the rock itself? It may be that the answer shifts depending on the wall, the cave, the season, the artist. Some were shared, some were secret, some were for the future, some for the dead, some for no one at all. What does it mean to create something meant to be forgotten? In a world with no archives, no books, no photographs, what happens when a mind places itself into stone and walks away? That act may be the beginning of everything we call civilization, because it is the seed of permanence, the refusal of oblivion, the first resistance against the endless tide of the loss. These handprints, these animals, these lines of pigment in shadow, they are not survival, they are memory, and memory in the dark becomes more than recollection. It becomes ritual, and through ritual something remarkable begins to take shape, a world not governed solely by what is, but by what might be. The painted cave becomes a space where the invisible takes form, where possibility is rehearsed, and where imagination walks alongside memory. In this ritual of descent and creation, the early human becomes something more than an animal reacting to the world. They become a participant in shaping it. They become a storyteller. And what is storytelling, if not the first architecture of belief? To walk into darkness with nothing but fire and dust, and come out with a vision. This is the beginning of myth, not necessarily myth as fabrication, but myth as a way of knowing, a system for holding what cannot be measured. In a world without books, without monuments, without anything to carry meaning beyond the body, these walls became the earliest canvas of continuity. Through pigment and breath, memory was externalized. Thought was made spatial. The interior life of the human mind was placed tenderly, deliberately into stone. Is this the first echo of culture? It may be, for culture is not tools alone. It is shared meaning. It is the recognition that you and I can look at the same thing and see more than its surface, that we can agree or wonder about what it means. And here, in these darkened sanctuaries, that agreement begins. Whether in solitary trance or communal ceremony, something collective emerges, a language beyond language, a grammar of shape and motion and shadow. The act of painting becomes the act of joining, not just with others, but with the world itself. The animal is no longer just something to chase. It is something to understand, to honour, to imagine. The wall is no longer just rock. It is surface. It is skin. It is boundary and bridge. The cave is no longer just shelter. It is stage and tomb and womb. These transformations do not happen by accident. They happen through attention, through care, through the repeated gesture of meaning-making, and meaning once created does not fade easily. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, we return to these caves, not with torches, but with eyes wide open, with lights that do not flicker, and boots that do not slip, and instruments that measure with clinical precision. And yet the mystery remains intact. The shapes are still there, but the intentions shimmer just out of reach, like firelight on wet stone. What does it say about us that we keep trying to understand? That the call of these silent chambers still echoes in our minds, that the question of why go into the dark, why paint at all, still keeps us awake. Perhaps it is because we recognise something of ourselves in that gesture. The need to pause, to mark, to make visible the invisible, to answer the formless with form, to declare, this mattered, I saw, I felt, I made. And so, the call in the dark was never a call of fear. It was a call of wonder, and someone long ago answered it, with fire, with breath, and with stone. And so, the call in the dark was never a call of fear. It was a call of wonder. But wonder does not emerge fully formed. It is not a lightning strike. It is a slow ignition, tinder before flame, gesture before art, thought before image. Before the first brush touched cave stone, before ochre met fingertip, there was a far quieter revolution unfolding, one so subtle it left no murals, no monuments, only clues, whispers in ochre-streaked stones, beads carved by hand, a line incised not by accident, but with purpose. Before there were painters, there were thinkers, and before there were thinkers, there were imaginations awakening. What must it have felt like to imagine something that wasn't there? To look at a piece of red ochre and see more than mineral, to run fingers along a smooth pebble and envision shape. This capacity, to hold in the mind a world not yet real, was not always with us. It emerged slowly across generations, like a language being learned in silence, and it changed everything. For once a mind can imagine, it can remember, it can plan, it can hope. It can create not just tools, but meaning. This shift, known as the cognitive revolution, marks one of the most profound turning points in human history. It did not begin in the caves of France or the cliffs of Sulawesi, but long before, when early Homo sapiens were still moving across savannas and coastlines, still shaping bone into needles and flint into blades. Somewhere between survival and story, something fractured the silence of the mind and filled it with symbols. What happens when thought gains gravity? In South Africa's Blombos cave, archaeologists uncovered a piece of ochre, engraved with a crosshatched design more than 75,000 years old. It is small, easy to miss, but in its marks lie a leap of thought. These were not functional carvings. They do not sharpen the stone or bind it to a tool. They serve no purpose, unless the purpose is expression. That is where art begins, not with beauty but with intention, with the decision to mark something simply because it can be marked. Could that be the first brushstroke? Nearby, other objects deepen the mystery. Shell beads, strung with sinew, carved bone points, pierced and worn, pieces of red ochre ground smooth by hand. These are not the chaotic leftovers of survival. These are traces of ritual, of ornament, of identity extended beyond flesh. Once we begin to decorate, we are no longer just existing, we are curating. The body becomes a surface, the mind becomes a gallery. Meaning begins to travel not just through speech, but through shape, through repetition, through echo. How do you trace the beginning of meaning? Perhaps not with grand images, but with small decisions, engraved. pierced, worn, and left behind. Each of these gestures, humble and fragmentary, carries the same seed that would one day bloom on the walls of Lascaux. Before the first painted horse, there was a bead polished by patience. Before the first herd of bison emerged from pigment and smoke, there was an ochre stone rubbed smooth between human palms. These were not yet artworks. They were meditations, moments of awareness folded into matter. A mind pausing long enough to say, "This is special." And in that pause, something new was born. What changes when we begin to choose what we carry? For millions of years, our ancestors shaped tools that could cut, scrape, or dig. The evidence of survival is everywhere. Axes, flakes, hammer stones. But somewhere along the journey, a new kind of object appeared, one that served no obvious purpose. Shells drilled and strung into necklaces, feathers arranged in deliberate patterns, red ochre smeared on skin and stone. These were not tools for the hand, but for the self. They marked belonging, memory, or beauty. They hinted that humanity had turned inward. In this quiet transformation, we see the dawn of symbolic thought, a world where objects could stand for ideas, where colour could mean courage, shape could mean kinship, and gesture could mean gratitude. This was no longer instinct, it was abstraction, and abstraction is the first whisper of imagination. What does it take for an animal to see a mark and understand it as meaning? The answer lies not in one moment, but in many. Across Africa, Europe, and the Levant, fragments of this awakening appear like scattered stars. In the Clayseas River caves, pigments were prepared and stored in carved containers. At Pinnacle Point, ochre mixed with fat and ash was used perhaps as paint. Each of these discoveries, though separated by thousands of miles and generations, points to the same slow shift, the emergence of minds capable of planning, remembering, and symbolizing. It was not a sudden leap, but a layering. Each generation inherited not only tools, but thoughts. Each mark carried the memory of a mind that once imagined. Slowly the invisible became visible. But imagination does not emerge in silence. It requires conversation. Between generations, between memory and curiosity. The old passed down not just skills, but stories. Even before words took shape, gesture and sound carried pattern and rhythm. The first storytellers may not have spoken sentences, but they understood sequence. This happened, then that. Cause and effect. Before the first painting, there was the grammar of experience. How do you paint a world when language is still learning to speak? By feeling it first. By touching stone and remembering what warmth feels like, what red means, what light does when it strikes a cave wall. These sensations would one day become symbols, but here, in the time before the first brush, they were simply perception. Raw, unfiltered, human. But perception, once recognized, begins to gather weight. It becomes not just response, but memory. It becomes something that can be held, shared, passed between hands and across time. And here, at this threshold, between instinct and imagination, between reaction and reflection, something irreversible began to stir. A mind that could imagine began to shape a world that could be remembered. What happens when memory detaches from the moment? It begins to drift. It begins to find anchors in pigment, in repetition, in object. That drifting memory is what allowed a carved bead to become more than decoration. It became a signal, a pattern worn across the chest, or placed with the dead, not to survive, but to speak. The earliest figurines, like the famed Venus statues, round-bodied, faceless, palm-sized, appear across Europe and Siberia more than 30,000 years ago. Their meaning remains obscure. Were they fertility icons, protective charms, ancestral symbols, or were they mirrors, offered not to others but to the self? What compels a mind to sculpt a body? The figurine is not a tool. It does not feed, clothe, or defend, and yet it endures. The earliest known examples, like the Venus of Hohlefels in Germany, date back more than 40,000 years. Made from mammoth ivory, the figure is deeply abstract. No face, exaggerated features, an idea more than a person. But that idea had meaning. It lived first in thought, and only then in form. That reversal, the interior world taking shape in the exterior, is the signature of symbolic cognition. And what does it mean when the inner world becomes visible? It means that consciousness has begun to reflect, to fold back on itself. The mind sees the world and then sees itself seeing. This loop, this mirror, is where art is born. Not just in the representation of a thing, but in the awareness that the representation represents. The earliest ochre engravings, the beads, the figurines, they all share this quality. They are not reactions. They are statements. I saw, I felt, I remembered, I made. And so begins the long lineage of the human mind sculpting its own echo. But what drove it? Not hunger, not shelter, not even safety. The urge to mark, to ornament, to carry and wear and place. These emerge from something more elusive, a need to signify, a need to say, this matters. And maybe, more profoundly, I matter. In a world ruled by uncertainty and the sheer immediacy of survival, these marks were declarations of presence. They grounded the self in time, in clan, in cosmos. How do you become real in a world that forgets you as soon as you vanish? You leave something behind, and in doing so, you change the very nature of what it means to exist. No longer are you only a body moving through space and time. You become a ripple, an imprint, a fragment that endures beyond the fading of breath. This, perhaps more than anything else, defines the slow unfolding of the artistic mind. It is not simply the making of objects, it is the making of self through the making of symbols. What is a symbol, if not a memory with direction? Direction is everything. A scratch on stone becomes writing when it points beyond itself. A red line becomes language when it carries intention. The human brain, once equipped to hold patterns, began to map them. One gesture could stand for another. One shape could stand for an event, and slowly the ability to imagine allowed for the ability to project, forward, backward, inward. This is not decoration. This is cognition, and yet it is quiet. It leaves no grand monuments, no immediate drama, only small artifacts that whisper, a fragment of ochre, a tiny bead, a curve incised into bone. But behind each one lies a mind at work, shaping meaning in a world that offered none by default, a mind that looked at the chaos of nature and said, let me carve something out of this, something that points, something that connects. What do you become when you start to make connections? You become a storyteller. Not with words, perhaps not yet, but with rhythm, with pattern, with ritual. The storyteller is the one who says, this is how we mark time. This is how we remember the storm, the hunt, the loss, the birth. This is how we hold the invisible. Even if the voice was not yet language as we know it, the cadence was already forming. The drumbeat of shared meaning, the pulse of abstraction. And where do these early rhythms echo most clearly? In the places we keep returning to. The hearth, the grave, the cave, spaces that compress time, places where the past can be touched again. In burial sites dated to more than 100,000 years ago, red ochre is found dusted over bones, carefully placed. A farewell, a transformation, a gesture towards something after. Even in death, meaning was applied. The body, now motionless, was painted. The story continued. What kind of mind paints the dead? A mind that imagines what lies beyond the visible. A mind that dares to ask what cannot yet be answered. This is not only the birth of art, but of philosophy. The first questions were not, how do I survive, but why do I suffer? Where do they go? What remains? And in trying to answer, we mark stone, wore colour, carved shapes, and invented meaning. And the most remarkable thing, we still do. Across the centuries, across continents, the same instinct lingers like a breath passed hand to hand. We still draw lines that mean more than shape. We still paint with the urge to remember. We still place colour on skin, carve names into stone, hang tokens of love, of grief, of hope. We still trace the invisible. We are still the same species that knelt in the dirt to etch a pattern into ochre. Not because it would feed us, but because it said something words could not. What endures when flesh disappears. The marks, the echoes, the things we made when we didn't need to but chose to. These objects are the bones of thought. They remind us that before there were gods or laws or nations, there was this simple truth. We are the species that imagines, and imagination, once ignited, does not sleep. It builds, it wanders, it pushes beyond. So when we speak of cave art, of the great painted chambers buried in limestone and shadow, we must remember they were not the beginning. They were the flowering. The first brushstroke was not a brush, but a line drawn in the mind, a rhythm learned from waves, from firelight, from the breath of the sleeping next to us. The walls of Chauvet were not the first surface to receive meaning. They were simply the first to survive it. Where else did the early mind leave its fingerprints? In beads worn close to the heart, in figurines cradled in palm and ritual, in ochre ground fine and laid on skin, in the placement of the dead with care, with pigment, with stone. Each act, small, deliberate, was a rehearsal for something larger, the rehearsal for image, for symbol, for story. These gestures became the scaffolding on which painting would later rise. And when it did, when the torch met the cave wall and the pigment kissed the rock, it was not a miracle from nowhere. It was an inheritance. An echo passed from hand to hand for tens of thousands of years. From the carved bead to the painted bison is not a leap, but a path, winding, worn, invisible yet deeply felt. How far back does the thread of art run? Farther than pigment, farther than brush. It runs through the first memory that was too precious to forget, through the first dream that begged to be shared, through the first loss that left a silence too large for language, through the first joy that filled a body beyond what movement alone could hold. Before the first brush, there was the first longing, and longing once born finds form. So let us not begin the story of art in the cave. Let us begin it in the breath, in the gesture, in the quiet decision to leave a mark even when no one may ever see it. Because that was the moment a mind became more than mind. That was the moment it began to create. There is a silence in the caves that does not belong to the absence of sound. It is a silence of meaning, a silence that listens back. In that dark, humid stillness, where the rock sweats and the earth breathes, we find not just the oldest paintings made by human hands, but something older still, the echo of thought taking shape. These caverns, carved not by human tools but by time and water and pressure, became more than shelter. They became something sacred, not in the way of religion, but in the way of resonance. The cave was not a room, it was a mind. What happens when we step into the dark with only fire to guide us? The caves that hold prehistoric art were not easy places to reach. They were not chosen for convenience. Chauvet, in southern France, lies far beneath the earth's surface, an ascent down narrow shafts, twisted passages, jagged chambers. Lascaux, too, winds like a labyrinth, enclosing the visitor in a world apart from the surface. And in Indonesia, on the island of Sulawesi, caves cling to limestone cliffs, requiring treacherous climbs through heat and forest. The artists who left their handprints, their bison and lions and stags, did not stumble into these spaces. They sought them. They returned to them. They lingered there in the dark. Why? The walls of these caves are not blank. They move. The surfaces curve and dip and swell, like the contours of a sleeping body. The rock is not a canvas. It is a collaborator. The artists responded to it. They let it shape their vision. A bulge becomes the shoulder of an aurochs. A crack becomes the spine of a horse. The cave guides the image, but it also hides it. You cannot see everything at once. Light flickers, shadow distorts. Figures emerge and vanish as you walk, as you breathe, as the torch in your hand gutters in the stale air. The painting is not static. It is performance. What kind of mind paints with moving light? To paint in these conditions is not merely to depict, it is to conjure. The fire animates, the animal moves, the bison lowers its head, the lion turns, the hunt begins, and then it is gone. The image dissolves back into stone. In this way, the cave becomes not only a place of vision, but of transformation, not just an image of the animal, but the being of the animal. Not just the handprint of a person, but the presence of a person. The cave holds these presences in a way that no open-air painting ever could. The darkness is not a void, it is a veil. What does it mean when a place becomes an extension of the mind? A cathedral is not just a building, it is a vessel for belief. The cave, long before architecture, held that role, not made by humans, but imbued with meaning by them. And like the mind, it was layered, recursive, full of echoes. Literal echoes too. The caves do not simply contain images, they respond. Archaeologists and acousticians have discovered something haunting. Many of the chambers that feature Paleolithic paintings also possess unusual acoustic properties. Clap your hands, hum, strike a stone, and sound lingers, bouncing back from the walls with rich, unpredictable reverberation. In some cases, the places where animals were painted correspond precisely with zones of heightened resonance. The bison sings, the stag echoes, the cave answers back. What does it mean to paint in a place that speaks? It means that these images were not silent. They were experienced. Seen, yes, but also heard. The painted chambers may have functioned as the first performance halls, where light and sound wove together into ritual. Perhaps voices rose here, chanting, murmuring, reciting what could not yet be written. Perhaps drum beats, struck with bone or stick, reverberated off the stone, setting the air in motion, summoning something just beyond the grasp of sight. In this way, the cave was not just decorated, it was activated. And when light joins sound, something profound emerges. Imagine a torch in the darkness. Its flame flickers with each breath, each movement. Shadows stretch, collapse, lurch across the walls. A painted ibex leaps as the light moves. A lion prowls. A horse gallops. But they do so only in the eye of the beholder. The effect is cinematic, theatrical. Early humans not as passive viewers, but as participants in a dynamic, multi-sensory environment. They were not merely painting, they were conjuring. Not just images, but moments, experiences, episodes in a mythic memory. And here the cave becomes not just mind, but dream. The unconscious, the symbolic, the layered. The cave mirrors all of these. Its interiority reflects our own. You cannot see all of it at once. You must navigate it slowly, torch in hand, perception shifting with each step. The cave asks you to pay attention, to commit, to listen, to smell, to feel the air grow colder. Its meaning does not lie on the surface. It must be entered, explored, interpreted. Like memory, like metaphor, like myth. Were these caves the first temples? It's possible, but only if we expand what we mean by temple. Not a house of gods, but a house of experience, a chamber for the sacred that does not yet have a name. There are no altars, no statues, no writing, only images and absence. But in that absence there is room for encounter. The cave may not have been a place to worship, but a place to become, to step out of the ordinary and into something shaped by mystery. The flickering light, the enveloping dark, the resonance of sound, the shifting form of image. This was not art as object. This was art as space. And space, when it speaks to all the senses, becomes more than background. It becomes story. The cave was a narrative, not just a container. A winding sequence of chambers, thresholds, bottlenecks and openings. Each turn a reveal, each narrowing a choice, each widening a breath. In some caves, images are clustered near entrances. In others, they lie deep inside, accessible only to those who venture far. Some are perched high on ledges, visible only from specific vantage points. Others are tucked low, asking the visitor to crouch, to bow, to humble themselves. What is a journey, if not a way to prepare the mind? The path into the cave mimics a descent, not just into the earth, but into the psyche. The deeper one goes, the more immersive the experience becomes. Daylight is lost, orientation fades, the senses shift. It is in every way a transition space between the known and unknown, surface and depth, noise and silence. These are the classic ingredients of ritual, of vision quest, of initiation. And though we can never know for certain how Paleolithic people framed their experiences, the design of the caves suggests intentionality. They invite not casual visits, but pilgrimages. What awaited them in those deep chambers? Often, it was not just one image, but many, overlapping, layered, etched and re-etched across generations. Herds of animals in motion, spiraling compositions, ambiguous symbols. Horses gallop alongside lions. Mammoths loom near bison. Dots, hand stencils and abstract signs punctuate the animal forms. Some images are naturalistic, full of grace and movement. Others are schematic, almost cryptic. The cave is not a gallery, it is a palimpsest, a memory layered upon memory, and that memory is not passive, it is activated by presence. To be in the cave is to become part of the story. Your torchlight touches the wall and brings it alive. Your footsteps echo where others once walked. Your breath mingles with the stale air, still trapped from centuries ago. The space remembers. It holds sound and light and gesture, and in that act of holding it becomes something more than physical. It becomes symbolic. What is symbol if not the folding of time? When Paleolithic artists painted their animals, they did not place them randomly. There is evidence that the placement of images correlates with the acoustics, the topology of the cave, and even the symbolic weight of certain chambers. In some sites, the animals face one direction. In others, they seem to migrate. Certain chambers teem with life, while others remain empty, perhaps reserved for silence. These are not only aesthetic choices, they are narrative ones. The cave is telling a story, but it speaks through space, through scale, through echo, through the play of light on mineral. It is architecture before buildings, theatre before stages, language before script. Because long before writing, long before alphabets and glyphs, the cave was already communicating. Not in words, but in arrangements, impressions, sensations. Meaning didn't reside in any single image, but in how it was placed, how it was approached, how it appeared and disappeared with the dance of the flame. The cave was not speaking to the visitor. It was speaking with them, drawing them into dialogue. A communication not of explanation, but of experience. What do we call a place where we go to feel rather than to know? In modern terms, we might say sanctuary, but even that word feels too narrow, too defined. The cave was more than sanctuary. It was simulation. Not of an outer world, but of an inner one. Shadows become metaphors, echoes become memories, shapes become spirits. The mind reflects off the wall and sees something more than itself. It sees the invisible clothed in colour. It sees emotion made form. And this brings us to one of the most provocative ideas, that the cave was not merely a place in which to paint, but itself a kind of mind. Neuroscientist David Lewis Williams and others have speculated that the caves functioned as projections of inner states, as models of altered consciousness. In dreams, in trance, in reverie, the brain produces imagery, fluid, shifting, symbolic, and in these caves, where darkness isolates, where flickering fire mimics hallucination, where echo disorients, those inner visions could be externalized, painted, performed, shared. What if the cave was a dream made visible? The idea might seem poetic, but consider what it means to return, again and again, to these shadowed hollows, to descend with tools and pigment, to light fire not just for warmth, but for movement, to know that an image will only ever be seen through flame, never in fixed light. This is not just painting, it is ceremony, it is staging, it is the construction of meaning in a liminal space, and liminality is key. In anthropology, a liminal space is a threshold, a transition zone between one state and another, between child and adult, life and death, known and unknown. The cave, as a physical and sensory environment, carries all the traits of such a threshold. The narrowing passages, the sudden chambers, the muffled sound, the changing temperature, the dancing light, everything is transformed, including the person who enters. So perhaps the artist didn't just descend into caves to leave images. Perhaps they went to become something different, to encounter something not available in the daylight world, to see with different eyes, to hear with different ears, to feel in a way that the open plains could never permit. And in that feeling they created a new kind of space, not of shelter, but of symbolic interiority. A space where thought could take shape in gesture and pigment. A space that looked not outward, but inward. And in doing so, it revealed something extraordinary, that consciousness, when given shape, can become a place, a terrain, a landscape we enter not only with bodies, but with minds attuned to shadow and silence. In this way, the cave was not a container for art. It was the art, the totality of it, the dark descent, the echoing chamber, the painted curve of stone, the breath held in wonder. each element designed not to explain, but to evoke. It's no accident that we still describe moments of clarity as illuminations, that we picture thoughts as things that happen in rooms, in halls, in chambers of the mind. The cave was our first metaphor for thought itself. Closed, winding, silent, filled with unseen images. And to enter it was to step into the mystery not of the world, but of being alive within it. So what then did the cave offer the first painters? Not answers, but questions shaped by experience. What does it mean to remember? What does it mean to see? What does it mean to feel something so deeply that it demands a mark be made? A line, a curve, a breath turned to pigment. The caves did not teach people how to think. They revealed what it felt like to think. And that perhaps was the most profound innovation of all. Because once you externalize the mind, once you make it visible in a space, you can return to it. You can visit. You can reflect. You can share. And others, stepping into the same chamber, can feel what you felt, see what you saw. Not exactly, but enough. Enough to build a bridge across time, across silence, across all the forgotten names and vanished tongues. The cave becomes a message, not in language, but in presence, in form, in the arrangement of sensation. And unlike spoken words which vanish, or even bones which decay, the cave remains. Its shadows hold. Its images persist, its walls remember. And in that persistence it becomes something more than artifact. It becomes participation. We do not simply study these caves, we enter them. We follow the same path, light the same torch, see the same flicker, and in that shared seeing we become part of the story. So as we leave this chapter, this threshold, it's worth pausing, to reflect on what it means that our ancestors chose such places, such methods, such effort, that they ventured into the deep, not for food or fire or safety, but for something else, something they couldn't hold, only make, a gesture into mystery. And in that gesture the cave was transformed. It was no longer merely stone. It was a mirror, a mind. They are not still. The horses gallop, the mammoths march, the lions prowl, and yet they do so in silence, in shadow, on walls of stone. This is not a catalogue of species. It is not a record for taxonomy or an ancient field guide. What we find in the painted chambers of Chauvet, Lascaux and beyond is not zoology. It is invocation. The animals are not there to be seen, they are there to be felt, and perhaps even to be spoken to. Why animals? Why so many? Of the thousands of images that decorate Paleolithic cave walls, a vast majority are of non-human creatures. Lions, bison, aurochs, rhinos, bears, ibex, horses, painted with grace and vigour, their bodies rendered in confident lines, their musculature alive with motion. In Chauvet alone, nearly 75% of the known figures are animals, often clustered in dynamic groupings, interacting not only with each other, but with the very contours of the cave walls. And what's striking is what's absent. Humans. Rarely do we see ourselves, and when we do, the depictions are vague, abstract, even hybridized, part animal, part human. What does this tell us? It suggests that animals were not others in the way we might think of them today. They were not background creatures to human drama. They were the drama, the centre of meaning. They occupied not just the physical world of Paleolithic peoples, but their spiritual one. To see the world was to see it through the animal, and in this we glimpse something ancient, a world before the boundary hardened between the human and the wild. This is where the idea of totemism enters the story. Totemism, in its many cultural forms, is the belief in a spiritual kinship between humans and certain animals. In some traditions, this connection is familial. A clan descends from the wolf or the bear or the eagle. In others it's symbolic. An individual takes on the traits of an animal as a guide or protector. The cave art, especially when viewed in the flickering dance of firelight, begins to suggest just such a worldview. These are not illustrations. They are not entertainment. They are presences. To look at the painted wall is to step into a relationship. And that relationship is not casual. It is reverent. In many hunter-gatherer cultures across the world, animals are approached with ritual and respect. They are not merely hunted, they are asked. Before a kill, a prayer. Afterward, a gesture of thanks. The animal is not just food, it is ancestor, it is teacher, it is the spirit that makes life possible. And this spiritual ecology, the intricate weave of survival and sanctity, is visible in every line, every curve of pigment on those cavern walls. The animal is not painted because it is useful, it is painted because it is sacred. And in this sacredness, the animal becomes more than a figure. It becomes a portal, a means through which human consciousness reached beyond itself, into the world of forces unseen but deeply felt. Shamanic traditions, though culturally varied, share a recurring pattern. A figure, often in trance, journeys to other realms of existence, guided or transformed by animal spirits. And in the caves, we find whispers of this very process. Take, for instance, the sorcerer of Les Trois Frères in France, a figure that seems to merge man and beast. Antlers crown its head, animal limbs protrude from its frame. It dances or crouches or communes, it's hard to tell. But what is clear is that this is not a depiction of an ordinary person. It is an interface, a being between. It suggests that Paleolithic people may have understood transformation, not just physical but spiritual, as a vital living reality. To become an animal in ritual was to cross into another state of awareness. In this view, the cave becomes not just a sanctuary, but a threshold, a place where the everyday world fades and the spirit world becomes near. The animals, then, are not passive objects of observation. They are agents, interlocutors, beings with whom communication is not only possible but necessary. Whether through dance, chant, pigment, or trance, the painted animal was a presence to be encountered, not watched, but engaged. What did they ask of these beasts? Perhaps they asked for permission to hunt, to live, to thrive. Perhaps they asked for guidance, or protection, or insight. Or perhaps they didn't ask at all, but simply entered a state of being with, a mutual recognition across the species divide. What we can say is this: the cave walls are not covered with the animals most often hunted for meat. In fact, many of the species depicted, such as lions or rhinos, would have been rarely if ever consumed. This suggests something powerful, that the animals most revered were not those most useful, but those most awe-inspiring. The lion for its silence and strength, the mammoth for its vastness, the horse for its speed and grace, the rhino for its mystery and force. These were not just animals, they were archetypes, embodiments of forces far larger than the individual human. In painting them, Paleolithic people may have been trying not to control the world, but to commune with it. And it is communion, not domination, that defines this early relationship. Before agriculture, before fences and domestication, humans lived in a world where the boundary between species was permeable. They were prey as often as predator. They shared water, shelter, and space with the wild. And in that shared existence there arose not only necessity, but reverence. The kind of reverence that asks not, what can this animal do for me, but what does this animal mean? That is a question that resonates far beyond survival. It reaches into the symbolic, the spiritual, the mythic. And indeed, in these ancient walls we begin to glimpse a pre-verbal mythology, a system of meaning rooted not in story as we know it, but in form, in presence, in essence. The animal becomes not a character in a tale, but a living symbol in a sacred geometry of space and pigment. And this symbolic role goes even deeper when we consider the dynamic qualities of these depictions. Many of the animals in Paleolithic art are shown in motion: a galloping horse, a bison mid-stride, horns that arc like crescents, limbs that stretch and reach. The artists were not content with static poses. They captured movement, life, energy. But why? These images were not made for sustained viewing in bright light. They flickered in the half-dark of torch or flame, dancing with the shadows cast by irregular cave surfaces. This is not coincidence, it is choreography. When light moves across these forms, the animals come alive, not in illusion, but in suggestion. The curve of a rock becomes the flank of a bull. The rise in the wall becomes a leaping shoulder. The cave itself participates in the animation. And in this interplay of fire, form, and imagination, something extraordinary happens. The painted animal becomes not an image, but a spirit, a visitation. Shamanic traditions around the world often involve vision quests in dark enclosed spaces, caves, huts, tents, where sensory deprivation leads to altered states of consciousness. There, the seeker encounters guides, beings who teach, warn, or initiate. Often, these guides are animals. Is it so far-fetched to think that the same dynamic played out in Paleolithic Europe or Indonesia? That the walls, once lit, became stages for communion? And here we arrive at another insight. These caves may have been less about representation and more about transformation. To paint a horse was not to say, "Here is a horse," but rather to become horse-like, to embody the spirit of gallop and freedom. To paint a lion was not merely to depict it, but to draw its essence close, to risk its nearness, even in image, and thereby gain something of its power. This is the logic of invocation, to name, to shape, to summon. What a strange, beautiful transaction. And we, modern visitors to these caves, often forget just how revolutionary this act was. These paintings were among the first times in history that something not immediately present, a memory, an idea, a force, was made visible. The animal spirit, once elusive, now flickered in ochre and charcoal. In this way, the cave was not a record, but a revelation. And to stand in that space was to witness a world where humans did not place themselves above nature, but within it. Not as masters, but as kin, as participants in a living, breathing world that pulsed with forces far greater than any single individual. This worldview, what some have called spiritual ecology, was not just a belief system, but a way of perceiving reality. The animals were not separate from the sacred. They were the sacred. And the act of painting them was not an artistic pursuit as we understand it today. It was communion. In many indigenous traditions, this ecological reverence remains. The Inuit hunter prays before the seal. The sand healer dances with the eland. The Amazonian shaman sings to the jaguar. These are not rituals of sentimentality. They are acknowledgements of relationship, of deep reciprocal entanglement. And they echo unmistakably in the shadowed chambers of Paleolithic caves. So much of what modern humanity has forgotten, these walls remember. They remember the world before fences, before domestication, before the wild was tamed and catalogued and confined. In those ancient days there were no farms, no herds, no petting zoos. There was only the open world, and within it a fabric of interdependence. To follow the herds was to live, to track them was to know. To hunt them was to participate in a cycle that had no hierarchy, only rhythm. And perhaps that rhythm is what the paintings tried to capture. Not just the shape of the animal, but the pulse, the beat of hoof on earth, the breath of predator in pursuit, the stillness before the strike, the quiet after death. These were not just observations, they were experiences, lived, felt, revered. To paint them was to remember, and in remembering, to honour, not as conquerors, but as kin. And kinship implies responsibility. If the lion is your brother, the bison your elder, the mammoth your ancestor, then the act of taking life becomes sacred, not casual. The cave paintings in this light may have served as both tribute and caution, a way of saying, we're not alone. We are part of something larger, and in this larger web, every act echoes. But over time, that balance shifted. With the advent of agriculture, the human-animal relationship changed. Animals became property, boundaries were drawn, the wild became wilderness, something to be entered or controlled. But in the Paleolithic, this division had not yet hardened. The cave art is a fossil record of a worldview now rare but not extinct, a time when animals were not resources but relations. And in that relational world, the painted wall was a kind of altar, a place where gratitude could be shown, where stories could be encoded, where memory could take form, not in words but in curves and colours, a memory that was not just of the hunt, but of the heart. Because to remember an animal is not merely to recall its shape or movement, but to recall its presence, its nearness, its strangeness, its power. In the silence of the cave, beneath the earth, that presence was not diminished, it was magnified. There, in the absence of the sun, lit only by flickering flame, the lion returned, the mammoth stirred, the bison huffed its ghost breath. The walls did not just display these creatures, they invited them. And so, the cave became a meeting place, not between humans and art, but between worlds. It was here, in these sacred chambers, that Paleolithic people may have gathered not simply to look, but to be with their dead, with their memories, with the animal spirits that shared their world and shaped their myths. These spaces were not galleries, they were ceremonies made of pigment and stone, a slow ritual of attention, repetition, and presence. We do not know their words. No stories survive intact, no names, no chants, or songs or prayers. But the images remain, and in them we glimpse a form of language older than writing, older, perhaps, than language itself, a language of gesture, of intuition, of reverence, that reverence is what endures. To paint the lion was not to control it, but to acknowledge its power. To paint the horse was not to break it, but to honour its freedom. And in this honouring, Paleolithic humans revealed something essential, not only about the world they inhabited, but about themselves. They were not simply observers of nature, they were in dialogue with it. A dialogue that did not depend on conquest or curiosity, but on presence, on being with, on seeing the animal not as object but as other, not as lesser but as luminous. These paintings are not about dominion, they are about devotion, about the fierce humility that arises when one stands before a being so different and yet somehow known. And so we arrive at the heart of the matter. The caves were not illustrated books, they were sacred thresholds, liminal spaces where the seen and unseen merged, where the past could be recalled and the spirit of the animal might return. In this sense, the Paleolithic artist was not a recorder of life, but a bridge builder between worlds, a witness, a summoner, a participant, and perhaps that is what we inherit. Not their technique, nor their myths, nor even their animals, but their gaze, their way of looking at the world not as something to exploit, but something to encounter, with awe, with respect, with the strange, wordless knowing that to be alive is to be in the presence of others, furred, feathered, scaled, or imagined. The animal spirits still move, not just in Pigment, but in us. The walls are alive with animals. Horses gallop, ibex leap, mammoths shiver beneath ancient moons, lions snarl in profile, bison lower their heads as if bracing against a wind no longer blowing. The caves of Europe, Asia, and Indonesia are filled with them. These creatures of muscle and breath, rendered in ochre and charcoal, flowing like dreams across the stone. And yet, one figure is strikingly, hauntingly, conspicuously missing. Us. Where are the humans? Where are the artists who painted these living murals? Where are the hunters, the children, the mothers, the dying? Where is the mirror? Why is it that in this vast archive of Paleolithic imagination, tens of thousands of images spanning continents and millennia, the human figure appears so rarely? And when it does, why does it appear broken, masked, monstrous? This is not a quiet omission. It is an unsettling silence, a presence defined by its absence, and that absence raises a deeper, more difficult question. What did Paleolithic people believe themselves to be? We live in a world saturated with self-image. Mirrors, portraits, photographs. Every face an identity, every pose a declaration. But in the caves of Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira and beyond, the human is either absent or fragmented into something else. A stick figure with a bird's head, a shadow with antlers, a limb without a body, a creature with neither face nor eyes. What are we looking at when we look at these missing humans? Some have said it is taboo, that the sacred could not be depicted, that to paint the human form was to risk summoning something too close, too dangerous, too unstable. Others suggest transformation, that these distorted figures are not failures of representation, but depictions of the boundary between human and animal, self and spirit, dream and waking. Still others believe it is a reflection of fear. To be seen is to be vulnerable, to reveal the self is to expose the soul, but perhaps the question is not simply why they were not drawn, but why they chose instead to become the animal. What does it mean to mask yourself in horns, to elongate your limbs, to dance in the flickering light as something other? What does it mean to hide the human beneath the skin of a beast? Could it be that in the deepest parts of the earth, where firelight flickers and shadows stretch like spirits, the human identity was not a fixed point, but a shifting current. And if so, what were they afraid of becoming, or afraid of forgetting? What happens when a species becomes aware not just of death, but of disguise? What does it mean to imagine oneself as something other? And why, in this gallery of ghosts, do we glimpse ourselves only in fragments? Why, in the great silence of the painted world, is the human voice the faintest of all? Perhaps it is because the self, to the Paleolithic mind, was not a subject to be displayed, but a boundary to be crossed. In so many cultures with roots in oral traditions, the self is not conceived as a singular identity, but as something porous, part dream, part animal, part world. The notion of a discrete individual, with clean edges and fixed roles, is a recent invention. To the ancient hunter, the self may have been fluid, seasonal, relational, a being that changed with the moon, that spoke in the voices of others, that wore the sky like a cloak. In such a world, why fix a face to stone? And when we do find humans, they are not portraits, they are symbols, suggestive, unfinished, alien. One of the most famous appears in the Well of Lascaux, a humanoid figure with arms outstretched, falling or dancing with the head of a bird. Nearby lies a disemboweled bison, its insides spilling like a prophecy. Is this a shaman in trance? A vision of death? A tale told through image and absence? We cannot know, but we can feel the strangeness of it. Another appears in Chauvet, a lower half of a woman fused with the upper body of a bison or perhaps a lioness. The figure is fragmented, hybrid, shifting. Is this a myth in motion, a spiritual being, a self-transformed? Again, we do not know, and that not knowing is part of the experience. These images destabilize us. They make us question not only what we see, but how we see. We expect humans to center themselves in their stories. But the Paleolithic world was not human-centric. It was relational, alive, teeming with powers that dwarfed the human form. The cave paintings reflect this decentering. They do not place Homo sapiens on a pedestal. Instead, they whisper, "You're not alone here. You're not the only presence. You are not the center of the world." In this way, the absent human is not a mistake. It is a message that unsettles our modern gaze, trained to find itself in every reflection. But in the flicker of the Paleolithic cave, the human figure dissolves. It blurs. It shifts into shadow and smoke, into mask and metamorphosis. What remains is not a self-image, but a field of relation, a web of spirit, breath, and presence. And into that web the artist steps, not to stand apart, but to disappear within. The hunter becomes stag. The dancer becomes bird, the painter becomes wind, and we, thousands of years later, are left with only the trace, the fading outline of a soul that never stood still long enough to be drawn. This is not just an artistic decision, it is a philosophical one. In the Paleolithic cave, representation was not documentation, it was invocation. The purpose of the image was not to depict what was, but to engage with what is becoming. And becoming, by its very nature, resists the fixed form. The human, perhaps more than any other creature, is in flux, alive not just in the flesh, but in the dreaming. To draw the human might have been to trap it, and so they left themselves out, or left themselves as shadows, as shapes half seen. The human hand, stenciled in red on the wall of El Castillo, is as close as we get. A presence without a face. A touch without a voice. But even that, we must admit, is not a portrait. It is a threshold. A trace. The theories multiply. Some scholars suggest these human absences were rooted in spiritual caution, like the Islamic or Orthodox Christian prohibitions against graven images, where the sacred cannot be held by line or pigment. To depict the self was to risk profaning it. Others argue it is a kind of humility, an ecological consciousness that resisted placing the self at the centre of the cosmos. Still others suggest something deeper, that in imagining themselves as animal, these early humans were engaging in a ritual of transformation. Not just symbolic, but real. Consider the hunter donning a mask of antlers, crawling on all fours, mimicking the breathing of the deer. In that moment, what is he? Actor, predator, preyer. The line blurs. The mask is not decoration, it is becoming, a dissolving of the self into the role, into the story, into the spirit of the other. The mask, then, is not concealment, it is connection. And so the human appears in disguise, in dream, in fragments. Because to appear fully would break the spell, would reassert ego in a world that sought communion. To put a face on the wall would be to say, I am here. But perhaps what the artist was saying was, we are here. We, the herd, the wind, the voice in the rock, the breath of the bison, the drumbeat of hooves across the plain. This kind of thinking is hard for the modern mind. We are taught to assert identity, to define ourselves, to stand apart. But the cave speaks a different language, one of belonging, not branding, one of merging, not marking. The rare human images we do find, masked, disjointed, surreal, are not failures of representation. They are invitations into a worldview where selfhood is not a fortress, but a firelight dance between selves. And that dance is what lingers on the walls, a dance of shifting forms, flickering truths, and the dissolving edge of the human figure. In the depths of the earth, firelight did not simply illuminate the paintings, it animated them. Shadows moved across the contours of the cave. A bison's hump bulged as the light shifted. A lion's snarl quivered with breath. A horse appeared to run. In such a space, the difference between reality and vision collapses. And in this sacred sensory world, perhaps the human figure was not lost, but transformed. The cave becomes less a place of absence than a stage of metamorphosis. Take, for instance, the sorcerer of the Trois Frères cave, a figure etched faintly onto stone. It has antlers, a long tail, possibly the limbs of a human, possibly not. It is neither wholly animal nor entirely man. Instead, it hovers in the space between, a being in transition. Some believe it represents a shaman mid-transformation, caught in the act of crossing thresholds. Others think it may be a spirit or even a deity, an image of the powers that governed the Paleolithic imagination. Whatever it is, it reflects a cosmology different from ours, one in which boundaries were not hard edges but membranes, where identity could shift like breath in cold air. The human did not stand above the world, naming and mastering it. Instead, the human moved within it, porous and permeable, subject to forces beyond their control. The cave was not a canvas, it was a threshold. And on this threshold, perhaps the greatest fear was not the beast in the dark, but the beast within. To depict oneself might be to confront this internal wilderness. The fear not of death, but of transformation. To draw the human could have been to make permanent what was meant to be passing. To fix the self when the truth was its impermanence. These fears are ancient, primal. And perhaps they were not merely metaphorical. In a world where survival meant adopting the patience of the predator and the alertness of the prey, blending into the landscape was not just symbolic, it was essential. So the human learned to disappear, in the art, in the hunt, in the story. And yet, even in disappearance, something remains. Not the face, not the body, but the intention. The human hand might not be drawn, but the human gaze is everywhere. The compositions are deliberate. The animals are posed in motion with tension, rhythm, grace. There is perspective, there is sequence, there is memory, there is meaning. The absence of the human figure does not mean the absence of the human mind. Quite the opposite. It suggests a presence so full, so aware, that it does not need to assert itself through image. It watches, it listens, it merges, it becomes shadow, and in becoming shadow it gains something strange and profound. Perspective. In relinquishing the ego, in vanishing from the visible, the human artist allows the world to speak through them. The cave becomes less a space of self-expression and more a vessel for a larger voice. The animals, the rhythms, the lines that spiral across rock, they do not simply belong to a painter. They emerge from a relationship, a listening, a reverence. This is where the modern eye falters. We are trained to search for the artist behind the art, to uncover their biography, their style, their statement. But in these Paleolithic sanctuaries, the artist is not an individual genius. They are anonymous, collective, embedded in the world they depict. They do not sign their name. They leave at most a handprint, a negative, a void surrounded by pigment. Even then, the hand is not a self-portrait. It is a gesture, I was here, but I am not the story. And yet, this is what makes the story so compelling. Because through this silence, through this deliberate vanishing, we begin to glimpse the contours of a very different kind of mind, one attuned to myth, to ritual, to transformation. A mind that knew its place was not atop the world, but within it. A mind that understood that to see clearly one must sometimes disappear. The absence of the human is not a gap to be filled, but a mystery to be respected. It challenges us to reconsider our own presence, on the screen, on the page, in the world. What does it mean that our ancestors, possessed of pigment, time and skill, chose not to paint themselves? What does it say about their vision and ours? Perhaps they were warning us, or perhaps they were freeing us. In either case, their message is clear. Identity is not the centre. Presence does not require portrayal. And the most powerful images may be those that leave space for the unknown, because in that space, imagination awakens. The human becomes not a figure, but a question, a movement between forms, a breath between beasts, a silence full of listening. In the deepest chambers of the cave, lit by flickering fire, the walls speak in animals, in symbols, in traces of hands and paws, and somewhere, barely visible, the human is there, not drawn, but felt, not shown, but heard, not centered, but surrounding, a whisper in the dark, a presence just outside the light, a soul that knew how to become wind and vanish into the world it loved. The paintings on the cave walls were not whispers from a single valley, or even a lone continent. They were echoes across an entire world. In the flickering firelight of a Paleolithic chamber in France, a bison surges forward. Half a planet away, beneath the limestone folds of Sulawesi in Indonesia, another animal leaps, traced by a different hand, yet eerily familiar. The pigments are different. The rock is different. The climate, the fauna, the people, all different. And yet, the gesture is the same. A curve of muscle, a swell of movement, a vision made visible. How is this possible? This is the moment the story expands. It leaves behind the notion of Europe as the silent cradle of symbolic art and dares to look further, deeper, toward a humanity not divided by geography, but connected by vision. The journey into the caves is no longer a Western myth. It is a human one. And this revelation, the sudden realization that images spanning continents and eons share a common visual language, leads us into one of the most profound questions in the archaeology of the mind. Did this art arise in one place, then spread? Or did it emerge everywhere, from something universal within us? In a cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, a painting of a wild pig stares back from a wall of stone. It was created at least 4,500 years ago, older than the most celebrated murals in France or Spain. The pig, with its bristled mane and expressive features, is not alone. Nearby, hand stencils bloom across the walls like ancient constellations. Fingers splayed, palms pressed, each one a ghost of presence, a signature of being. Thousands of kilometers to the south, in the caves of Borneo, even earlier images emerge. Ochre-red silhouettes of animals, some unidentifiable, others resembling banteng or deer, linger beneath layers of mineral deposits. Some of these images may be over 52,000 years old. They are, as far as we can tell, among the oldest pieces of figurative art ever found. They push the timeline of symbolic expression farther back than we once imagined, and still they echo. The shapes recall the horses of Lascaux, the lions of Chauvet, the mammoths of Rouffignac. The art is not the product of a single cultural line, but a resonance, like notes struck on opposite ends of a vast instrument, vibrating in uncanny harmony. Were these similarities born of contact, travellers crossing oceans long before we believed it possible, or did they arise independently, shaped by a deeper force within the human mind? This is the debate at the heart of the mystery. Was it diffusion or convergence? Cultural diffusion implies contact, migration, the passing of stories and symbols from one group to another, like fire from torch to torch. It suggests that somewhere a singular spark was struck, and from it art spread outward, echoing its origin. Convergent evolution, on the other hand, implies something far more haunting, that separate groups of humans, isolated by oceans and millennia, arrived at the same vision, the same symbolic grammar independently. that the urge to paint animals in motion, to press hands against stone to leave a mark, is wired into us all. But if so, what does that say about us? What kind of mind dreams the same dreams across 50,000 years and every possible horizon? The question does more than link archaeologists and anthropologists in scholarly debate. It unsettles something deeper, something elemental. If art emerged independently in different parts of the world, with similar forms and symbols, then we are not merely connected by ancestry, we are connected by cognition, a shared inheritance of imagination. It suggests that the artistic impulse, far from being a cultural anomaly, is a basic function of the human brain. Just as language arose in parallel forms, so too did the image. But before we reach toward answers, let us pause in the presence of the evidence. Imagine a narrow cave mouth, half swallowed by jungle. Inside, the light dims quickly, and the air grows heavy. You move through the dark with only a torch or a flickering flame. Then, suddenly, a panel of ancient ochre glows into view. A babirusa or pig deer traced in thick pigment, its body poised mid-stride. Above it, hand stencils form an arc, as if watching. This is not a mural on public display. It is a private altar, tucked in a forgotten corridor of time. The oldest known figurative artwork on Earth, created by hands long vanished, in a cave called Lengtedonge on Sulawesi. Now imagine another scene. Thousands of miles to the west, deep in the dark belly of Spain's El Castillo cave, a red disc pulses on the wall, created by blowing pigment through a hollow tube. Beside it, a handprint, negative and raw, as though the wall itself has absorbed a person. These marks date back at least 40,800 years. They may be even older. For a time, they were the oldest cave art ever dated. But more than that, they resemble the ones in Sulawesi, both in technique and in spirit. Similar gestures, separated by continents. So again, we return to our two theories. In the diffusion model, one origin point, likely Africa, radiates outward. As Homo sapiens migrated, they carried with them not just tools, but ideas. The artistic tradition spread, changing in form but retaining a core symbolic syntax. Hand stencils, animal figures, curved lines and dots. This idea appeals to our desire for narrative neatness, a seed planted in one place, flowering across the earth. But convergent evolution offers something else, something wilder. That different human groups, perhaps isolated for tens of thousands of years, would, given enough time and need, create nearly identical visual expressions. That the hand stencil, the oldest and most universal of marks, was not taught, but discovered, again and again. Like fire, like rhythm, like the story. If this is true, it would mean that symbolic thought is not a rare trait, but an inevitable one. That the human mind, left to its own devices, dreams the same shapes into being. That our ancestors didn't all learn to see the same way. They were born seeing this way. It's a humbling thought. That deep beneath the cultural differences and geographic distances, beneath the clothing and language and tools, there lies a shared neurological rhythm, a pulse of symbolic instinct. The same impulse that drew ochre across limestone in a Sulawesi grotto might be the one that leads a child today to trace their fingers through mud, or to draw faces in the condensation of a car window. The medium changes. The mind does not. This is not to flatten the past, or to erase the distinctiveness of each culture. On the contrary, it is to marvel at the tension between the local and the universal. Each painting carries its own ecological flavour, native animals, unique pigment sources, regional techniques. Yet within that diversity, a pattern repeats, not rigid, not schematic, but familiar, resonant, the way different bird songs still carry a sense of song. In the limestone casts of Borneo, these themes deepen. The figures there include not only animals but abstract symbols, ladder shapes, dots, parallel lines, arranged in ways that seem to hint at storytelling, or perhaps ritual mapping. Some are superimposed atop one another, creating layers of image that feel like layers of memory. These are not random scrawls, they are compositions, and their makers chose to venture into the most difficult hidden parts of the cave to make them. That decision, like those seen in Europe and Sulawesi, suggests intentionality beyond decoration. These were not idle doodles passed down for their aesthetic value. They were more likely experiences, acts, a performance of pigment and presence, of hand and light and breath. To enter these chambers was to enter a space apart from the everyday, a space of meaning. And across the world, again and again, people entered. This leads us to another layer of the mystery. If the same visual language emerged in multiple places, might the same inner landscape have been traversed as well? Was the cave not just a canvas, but a vessel for something shared, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically? That notion brings us closer to the heart of why this chapter matters. Because to explore the global pattern of cave art is not merely to catalogue similarities, it is to confront the foundations of the human condition. It is to recognise that our earliest ancestors were not just surviving, they were reflecting, they were crafting inner worlds and projecting them outward. In the darkness of the caves, they lit fires not only to see but to show. And what they showed, animals, signs, spirits, hands, appears in different corners of the earth, again and again. It suggests that our minds are not solitary chambers sealed by skin and history. They are mirrors of each other, and perhaps beneath everything else, we've always been drawing the same things, because we've always been dreaming the same dreams. And it is this continuity of vision that invites a deeper look, not just at what the art depicts, but at what it implies about the structure of the mind itself. Consider this. The same archetypes appear again and again. The animal not as meat or threat, but as symbol. The hand not as tool, but as trace. The dot, the line, the spiral. These are not random marks. They are expressions of thought made visible. They suggest abstraction, memory, pattern recognition, perhaps even the first inklings of myth. Across the world, these recurring symbols appear like echoes in a great mental landscape. Carl Jung in the 20th century would call this the collective unconscious, an idea long debated, often misunderstood. But in the context of Paleolithic art, it becomes less mystical and more observational. Whether or not we believe in inherited archetypes, we cannot deny the patterns. They're there, etched into the walls of caves that humans should not have survived long enough to decorate. Yet they did. And they left behind visions that reach across the millennia with quiet, insistent familiarity. In Australia, indigenous rock art, stretching back tens of thousands of years, shows similar tendencies. Animals in profile, hand stencils, ceremonial figures, sometimes depicted in a mix of realism and abstraction. In South Africa, at sites like Blombos Cave, we find engraved ochre blocks over 70,000 years old, decorated not with depictions of the world, but with geometric shapes. The zigzag, the crosshatch, the chevron. It is as though, even before there was representation, there was pattern, a will to order, a need to mark. And again the question stirs, why? Why did these early people, in places separated by oceans and epochs, begin to make symbols? What provoked this leap from perception to depiction? It may have had survival value, certainly. Symbols to mark territory, indicate danger, teach others. But many of these images lie in places no child could easily access, no prey animal would ever appear. Some were painted at great personal risk, in chambers only accessible by crawling through narrow rock corridors. These were not the acts of pragmatism, they were something else. Something closer to longing. Perhaps it was the desire to externalize the internal, to take the flicker of image in the mind and anchor it in the world. In this way, cave art becomes not just visual but cognitive, a record of thought, not just of sight, a trace of that astonishing moment when humans first realized they could dream in symbols, and then dream them onto stone. That moment, it seems, did not happen once. It happened many times. The emergence of symbolic art across the globe does not tell a single story. It tells a shared condition. And in doing so, it suggests that we were never as isolated as the continents made us seem. Not in the ways that matter. Not in the mind. This understanding, quietly profound, is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the caves. Not that they show us what our ancestors saw, but that they show us how they saw, how they thought. And in their thoughts, we recognize something unbroken, something that still lives in us. When archaeologists first began to accept that Sulawesi's cave paintings were older than Europe's, it disrupted a long-held narrative. For centuries, the story of humanity's symbolic awakening had been anchored in the caves of France and Spain. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira. These were the cathedrals of early thought. But now, with images emerging from Indonesia, Borneo, Australia and beyond, many older, some equally sophisticated, we must expand the frame. The art was never European, it was always human. And that revelation changes not just where we look, but how we look. Instead of asking which culture was first, we begin to ask, what were they all reaching for? What internal landscape were they navigating with pigment and fire and stone? The caves become less like isolated masterpieces and more like scattered pages of the same great ancient manuscript. A manuscript written not in words but in vision, in presence, in silence. This shared symbolic behaviour also reshapes our understanding of cognition. It implies that the capacity for metaphor, for myth, for abstraction, emerged early in Homo sapiens, and likely before they even left Africa. The seeds were already there, and as they spread they bloomed in parallel, shaped by local environments, but rooted in the same neurocognitive soil. In this sense, convergent art is not just convergent behaviour, it is convergent consciousness, and that idea that the mind, given time and darkness, will always find its way to the same shapes, the same shadows, the same flickers of imagined motion, is quietly breathtaking. It means that meaning is not a cultural luxury, it is a biological necessity. We do not simply survive, we narrate, we ritualize, we make marks, we make sense. From this vantage, the cave becomes less a mystery than a mirror. In its walls we glimpse not only the animals of the Pleistocene, but the outlines of ourselves, our fears, our stories, our sense of awe. These artworks are not just fossils of creativity, they are early declarations of personhood. They are the first time the human mind stepped outside itself and saw its own reflection, not in water, but in image. So across the earth, across the mind, the story repeats. In chambers buried by time and silence, the same hands rise, the same visions flare. Whether in Sulawesi, in Spain, in Borneo, or in the red sands of Australia, the impulse is the same, to reach beyond the visible and to leave a sign. Not only that we were here, but that we were already dreaming. And now, standing in the long afterglow of their fires, we too inherit the dream. Beneath the flicker of ancient firelight, a bison charges, but it does not move. Its outline, etched in ochre and charcoal, leans forward on the stone wall, frozen in a gesture of motion, forever about to leap, never quite arriving. This moment, part presence, part illusion, invites a deeper question. Why? Why was this image made? Why did early humans return again and again to paint animals in hidden caverns deep within the earth where no sun could reach and no eye could casually stumble upon their work? The paintings may seem spiritual, mystical, even, but they are also urgent. The very act of painting them, of crawling into the cold bowels of stone, lighting a torch, grinding pigments, and outlining a snorting, galloping beast, must have been driven by something more than idle beauty. So what was it? Was it ritual? Was it survival? Was it both? The hunting magic hypothesis, one of the earliest and most enduring interpretations, suggests that these images were not simply depictions, but invocations. By painting the animal, the hunter called it into being. By marking its body on the wall, they rehearsed the kill. The cave, in this view, was a rehearsal space for survival, a psychological preparation chamber where symbols stood in for flesh and bone. Just as a modern athlete visualizes victory before stepping onto the field, perhaps our ancestors visualized the hunt, its rhythm, its dangers, its climax, through line and pigment. But if this was hunting magic, why the precision? Why the reverence? Why the care in capturing the arc of a shoulder, the twitch of a tail, the glint of an eye? These are not simple diagrams of prey. They are not checklists. They are portraits, and they suggest something more layered, something beyond pure utility. Could it be that the act of painting was not merely about ensuring the hunt, but about sanctifying it? Not a strategy, but a ceremony? In this sense, the cave was not a classroom or a tactical map. It was a sanctuary, a place where the line between the real and the imagined blurred, where the stakes of survival met the mysteries of spirit. In creating these images, the hunter did not simply mimic the world, they engaged with it on a symbolic plane, they negotiated. They gave thanks, they perhaps asked permission. So what happens when a painting is both a prayer and a plan? when it is meant to bring meat to the fire but also meaning to the soul. This dual purpose, that an image can be both functional and sacred, is not foreign to us. Even now we surround ourselves with icons that guide us, that bring comfort, that bridge the abstract with the immediate. We tattoo symbols onto skin for luck. We leave tokens at graves, we look for signs, and so we return to the cave, not to marvel at old drawings, but to ask, what did these people believe would happen when they painted? What forces did they think they were speaking to? What worlds did they think they were opening? Perhaps the paintings were not meant only for the world we can touch, but also for one they believed hovered just beyond it, a spirit world, layered over the material like mist. In this view, the cave becomes not just a shrine to the hunt, but a threshold, a liminal space where the ordinary rules of reality, light, time, flesh, no longer fully apply. This brings us to another powerful interpretation, the cave as the site of initiation. What if these chambers were not only for the hunters, but for the learners, the adolescents, the not quite yet? Imagine the trembling torchlight casting dancing animals on the wall, and beside them, the wide eyes of a young initiate, crouching, watching, absorbing. The journey into the cave becomes a trial, not just of physical endurance, but of social transformation. A passage from one state of being to another. Here the art plays a different role, not as rehearsal, but as rite. Anthropologists have long noted how many indigenous societies use art, music, movement, and disorientation in their initiation ceremonies. Pain, darkness, altered states. These are not punishments, but tools. They open the mind, they empty the self. They prepare the individual to be reshaped, reborn into a new identity. And what more potent place for this transformation than a cave, silent, breathing with echoes, flickering with half-seen shapes. In this context, the paintings are not messages left for others. They are part of the ritual itself. Perhaps they were shown only to initiates. Perhaps they were explained, or perhaps their meaning was never spoken, only felt. The animal, looming above in charcoal and ochre, was not a biology lesson. It was a presence, a test, a mirror. And these ceremonies may not have been solitary events. The deep chambers may have held more than silence. There may have been voices, singing, drumming, breathing, the movement of bodies and firelight in sync, the art taking on motion and rhythm. The cave becomes theatre, not for entertainment, but for transformation. These interpretations do not cancel the hunting magic theory, they expand it. The cave can be many things. It can hold many meanings at once. And this is the crux of the viewer's challenge in this chapter, the realization that meaning, in the deep past, was not fixed or narrow. It was layered, symbolic, multivalent. A bison on the wall was not just food, it was also power, memory, test, spirit. It was real, and more than real. So too were the ceremonies that surrounded these images. They may have formed the basis of social cohesion, of shared belief, of generational knowledge. In this way, art becomes a glue, not decorative but structural. It binds a group together through shared vision, through ritual, through the symbolic language that transcends speech. In these caves, we do not just see the origins of representation, we see the birth of culture. And what is culture if not memory made durable? The ability to preserve ideas across time, across death, across silence. This brings us to a third interpretation, less spiritual perhaps, but no less profound. Cave art as a mnemonic device, a memory system, a visual archive carved into the bones of the earth. Imagine living in a world without writing, no maps, no lists, no written language to track seasons, migration patterns, or kinship ties. In such a world, image becomes everything. A painting is not decoration, it is knowledge. A bison may indicate where the herds travel in winter. A certain pattern of dots might represent water. A serpentine line may mark a river or a mythic journey. The art is not passive, it functions. Some researchers suggest that these images are part of a proto-cartography, a memory palace of stone. And like the memory palaces of oral cultures today, they may have worked through repetition, rhythm, association. A specific image in a specific place, near a cave bend or by a stalagmite, would cue a story, a teaching, a a practical lesson encoded in metaphor. In this way, the cave becomes a living map, navigated not by foot but by mind. This is not speculative fantasy. Among contemporary Aboriginal cultures in Australia, for instance, songs, dances and paintings carry information essential to survival, about weather, food, danger. Knowledge is stored in landscape and accessed through ritual. The idea that Paleolithic peoples did something similar is not a stretch. It is continuity. And here, the roles of ritual, memory and practicality blur into one. A ceremony may transmit social belonging, but it also transmits ecological knowledge. A painting may mark spiritual belief, but it also marks a useful path. Meaning does not fracture under scrutiny. It deepens. It reveals layers. This understanding invites a shift in perspective. The people who painted in these caves were not merely primitive artists groping toward beauty. They were engineers of meaning, builders of cognitive architecture. Their creations were not just expressions, they were tools. Tools for surviving, yes, but also for remembering, for belonging, for being. It is tempting in modernity to split the spiritual from the practical, to think of art as extra, as optional. But in the deep past, this division may not have existed. The real and the sacred were not in conflict. They were coextensive. A handprint could be a mark of presence, a spell, a lesson, and a symbol, all at once. And in this complexity we meet again the central trial of this chapter, ambiguity. Not confusion in the sense of ignorance, but in the sense of abundance. These paintings are not puzzles to solve. They are lenses to see through. They reflect a world where survival and symbol were never separate, because to live was to mean, and perhaps that's the quiet lesson hidden behind the ochre silhouettes and the flickering lines of charcoal, that Paleolithic humans didn't merely struggle to exist, they struggled to matter. Their rituals, their images, their ceremonies were not just responses to nature's brutality, they were invitations into significance, into coherence, into belonging, even amid uncertainty. Let us return again to the darkness of the cave. Imagine not a lone artist, but a gathering, a community, small, quiet, cold, torches lit, children watching, elders murmuring, a rhythmic chant building in tempo as pigment is applied to stone. The animal begins to appear, not all at once, but in stages. Head, shoulder, flank, hooves. The torchlight trembles, and with it the painted figure seems to move, to breathe. What is happening in this moment? It is not a classroom, and it is not theatre. It is something older. It is rehearsal and invocation. It is memory and myth. It is ritual, but it is also real. Because in that flickering moment, the painted animal is not a metaphor. It is the animal. Its power is present. The community is engaging with it, perhaps to honour, perhaps to transform, perhaps to survive. The term ritual often feels abstract, distant or overly academic. But what if we think of it differently? Not as performance, but as pattern, as rhythm imposed on chaos. In a world where lives were short, storms were long and food uncertain, rituals may have been our ancestors' way of shaping time, of creating predictability, of marking transitions, birth, death, puberty, harvest, hunt. And within those transitions, art played a role not just as backdrop, but as participant. It marked the change. It contained the knowledge. It stored the meaning. Some of the abstract symbols in cave art, grids, spirals, lines, remain untranslated. But their persistence across time and geography suggests something systematic. Could they represent sequences, seasons, phases of a ritual? Some researchers propose that dots and dashes may even correspond to lunar cycles or reproductive patterns of prey animals. If so, the cave is more than a canvas. It is a calendar. Other scholars note the repeated positioning of images. Certain animals always appear near cave entrances, others only deep inside. Perhaps this spatial organisation reflects levels of ritual complexity, or degrees of sacredness, or stages of narrative. Whatever the case, it points to planning, to intention. This was not casual graffiti. It was architecture, psychological, social, symbolic. And through it all, one sees a pattern of meaning layered atop survival. These people did not only live in nature, they lived with it. Through symbol, through art, through ritual that bound the real to the imagined, the harsh to the hopeful. We must remember, they were not practicing art in our modern sense. They were not trying to be artists. They were trying to be human. And perhaps this is the central revelation, the insight the viewer has been circling since the first brushstroke of this story. That the mystery of cave art is not a mystery of what, or even how, but of why. Why did they make marks that would outlast their lives? Why did they descend into darkness again and again, to shape shadow into symbol? Was it for the gods, for the children, for the hunt, for memory? Yes, perhaps all of it. And in that ambiguity lies the truth, not a single, clear answer, but a layered, resonant field of possibilities. The ritual and the real were not opposites. They were partners. The animal on the wall could be food, spirit, symbol, teacher. The cave itself could be shelter, sanctuary, classroom, cosmos. These are not contradictions. They are coherences. As we listen to these stories from the depths of time, we may feel the pull of categorization. Was it sacred? Was it useful? Was it art? Was it religion? But these are our questions, not theirs. In a Paleolithic world where death and birth were close neighbours and the wind whispered through bone and branch, there may have been no line between a myth and a map, between a painting and a prayer. Meaning was not supplemental, it was survival, not in competition with reality, but woven into it. This is what we learn when we sit with these images long enough, when we let their silence speak, when we allow ourselves to not just study them, but feel them. The hunt was real. The ritual was real. The memory was real. The image, enduring beyond flesh, was a bridge. And we, tens of thousands of years later, cross that bridge when we enter the cave, if not in body, then in mind. In this chapter, you, the listener, have faced a trial of interpretation. The story asked you to hold multiple meanings at once, to sit in a space where myth and material intertwine, to resist the urge for easy explanation, and instead accept complexity as a form of clarity. This is the turning point of your journey. You're no longer just looking at cave art, you're beginning to see with it, to see with their eyes. And so we step from this chapter not with a conclusion, but with a transformation. The paintings on the cave walls are no longer strange. They are familiar, not because we've solved them, but because we've listened to them, because we've begun to understand that their function was not just to record life, but to shape it. And in their lines, we begin to trace our own. Because ritual did not end in the caves, it simply changed forms. And even now, listening to this story, here, in the glow of screen or speaker, you too are participating in it. They gathered the fire first, because without it, there would be no vision, no shadows dancing across the walls, no breath of ochre misting into the contours of stone. Before any image could be born, there had to be light, and not the steady modern glare we know, but a wild, flickering, living light, torchlight, flame cupped in primitive vessels sputtering with fat and resin, burning animal bone and root. A light that moved, that reshaped the wall with every flicker animating the static, birthing motion from stillness. Imagine standing there, deep in a cavern where no sunlight had ever reached, and watching a rhinoceros seem to charge only when the flame wavered in your hand. This was not just illumination, it was invocation. And then there was pigment. It did not come easily. Ochre had to be sought, sometimes from miles away, harvested from the veins of ancient earth. Yellow and red, clay-rich and blood-deep, it spoke of iron and time and soil. Charcoal came from the fire itself, the carbon remains of trees long dead, now reborn in image. Manganese, rare and black as void, offered a deeper tone, harder to crush but enduring as stone. These were not paints from a store shelf. These were minerals, spirits of the land ground between stones and mixed with spit, with fat, with blood. A recipe written not in text but in touch, handed down through gesture and memory. What must it have felt like to dip one's hand into that sacred slurry, to feel the dust of the earth rehydrated with the breath of the body? And then came the breath itself, not a brush, not a pen, but the lips, the lungs, the exhale. Through hollow bones or clenched mouths, they sprayed the pigment onto the stone, often around the outline of a hand. A negative image, an absence that reveals presence. These hand stencils still linger on cave walls across continents, ghostly signatures of lives long vanished, and every one of them required breath. Not just metaphorical spirit, but literal, living breath. The same breath they used to speak, to sing, to gasp. They gave that breath to the wall. They made meaning from air. Is this not the essence of art? Not merely the end result, the graceful bison, the running horse, but the act, the grind of the stone, the taste of iron on the tongue, the warmth of fire licking the walls, the ache in the back after hours bent forward, whispering pigment into shape. These were not idle decorations. They were labours, and the labour itself was holy. So much of modern life is obsessed with the product, the finished painting, the final image. But in the Paleolithic world, perhaps the making mattered most. Perhaps the ritual of creation, the preparation, the tools, the repetition, was the point. What if every line was a prayer, every stroke a step in a journey deeper into meaning? What does it mean when the act of making becomes sacred? It means that time bends. That a moment becomes layered, present, past, and myth, converging in the flick of a wrist, the tilt of a torch, the press of a palm. The cave wall in this frame is not just a surface, it is a threshold, a membrane between worlds, between what is seen and what is felt, between the real and the imagined. And to place pigment there is to reach across that veil, not simply to depict, but to enter, to merge, to remember. The physical process of creation in these caves was far from casual. The pigments were prepared with care and consistency. Archaeological analysis of ochre processing sites shows repeated techniques. Stones used to grind, bones used as containers, mixtures combined with specific binders. These were not random acts of expression. They were practiced, repeated, handed down, a kind of craft, a kind of rite. In the caves of Pechmerle in France, hand stencils are overlaid with images of spotted horses. The same kinds of patterns appear in Indonesia, in the limestone caves of Sulawesi, over 14,000 kilometers away, separated by oceans and epochs. And yet the visual language echoes, negative handprints, dots, lines, animal silhouettes. Whether this is the result of cultural diffusion or convergent evolution, the message is clear. The act of image-making followed patterns that spanned both geography and time. And consider this, the toolkit. Across multiple cave sites, we find remarkably consistent tools. Stone pallets, grinding slabs, hollow bird bones used as blowpipes, bundles of moss, perhaps used as brushes or sponges. It's not difficult to imagine the toolkit of a Paleolithic painter, a pouch of pigments, a bone tube for spraying, a flint for fire, a stone for grinding. Simple materials but assembled with purpose. There is something moving in the quiet intimacy of it. An artist, crouched in the dark, arranging their tools not just for utility, but for ceremony. This wasn't just painting, it was performance. Imagine the crackle of fire echoing against damp stone. The artist, face smeared with pigment, breath steady, eyes locked to the curvature of the wall. They don't paint on a flat surface. They follow the stone's swell and dip, letting the cave shape the form. A bulge becomes the shoulder of a bison. A fissure becomes the spine of a horse. The wall isn't a blank canvas. It's a collaborator. The artist listens to it, moves with it. They don't impose the image. They discover it. That sense of discovery is what modern viewers often forget. We see the result, framed and sterile behind museum glass or printed on textbook pages. But to the artist, the image wasn't fixed. It was fluid. It lived in the dance of firelight. It shifted with shadow. It breathed with the artist. And so the ritual of creation became more than communication. It became transformation. Not just for the wall, but for the person kneeling before it. The act of painting was not passive. It required the whole body, hands to grind, lips to blow, knees pressed into cold stone, shoulders tense, breath measured, heartbeat rising with the rhythm of repetition. To paint in a cave was to inhabit an altered state. Not necessarily ecstatic or hallucinatory, though that may have been part of it, but attentive, deeply, reverently attentive, the kind of attention that erases the boundary between subject and object, between self and other. This physical engagement suggests a kind of trance, not the modern mystified image of a shaman in frenzy, but a quieter, more deliberate kind. A trance of presence, of absorption. The way a sculptor loses track of time, the way a singer forgets the room. In the cave, the artist became vessel. The pigment moved through them. The animal emerged. In this state, the process was likely rhythmic. Some researchers believe that tapping stones or chanting may have accompanied the painting, especially in acoustically resonant chambers. Certain parts of caves, such as those in Chauvet and Nio, produce echo effects when struck or sung into, frequencies that bounce and linger. It's as if the caves were tuned, not just painted, but sounded. In such an environment, the creation of an image could easily become ritual, not only visual but auditory, somatic, embodied. And this embodiment matters, because it ties the art not just to the eye, but to the whole human form. We often think of art as a product of the mind, an idea, a symbol. But here, in the darkness of these ancient galleries, we're reminded that art is also breath, muscle, skin. It is weight carried, pigment inhaled, fire sustained. The image doesn't float in abstraction. It emerges from friction, from work, from the tension of creation. This is why the motif of the handprint carries such power. It is both signature and process. The artist did not draw a hand, they placed it, and then, with deliberate breath, they sprayed pigment around it, creating the outline. What remains on the wall is not the image of a hand, but the space where a hand once was, a presence made visible by its absence. There is something almost heartbreaking in this, a ghost of touch, a fossil of gesture. We will never know the name of the person who left that print, but we know their breath. We know where their skin met stone. Across thousands of years, their act reaches us, not through language, but through labour, through presence. This perhaps is the most sacred offering of all, the gift of being seen, not as a figure or a god, but as a person who knelt in the dark and made something with their hands, who lit a fire, crushed a stone, breathed onto the world, and left a trace. But the trace is not just of their body, it's also of their mind, their attention, their care. The art tells us less about what they saw and more about how they saw, which animals mattered, which shapes stirred something in the spirit, which gestures they repeated again and again until they held meaning. The repeated motifs across continents, spirals, dots, zigzags, hands, herds, suggest not just individual expression, but a kind of shared visual grammar, a language without words, and like all language, it had syntax, rhythm, cadence, the placement of an animal, the spacing of prints, the progression of symbols. They weren't random, they followed patterns. In some caves, such as Chauvet, animals are layered in deliberate sequences, lions chasing bison, rhinos sparring, horses galloping in line. These aren't mere depictions, they suggest movement, narrative, perhaps even memory. Memory, in fact, is essential to this process. Long before writing, humans needed ways to store and transmit knowledge, to remember migrations, seasons, prey behaviour, social ties. Art became mnemonic, an external hard drive carved into the earth. When pigments touched the wall, they turned fleeting experience into durable symbol. And because the process was so embodied, so physical, the memory encoded in the art may have been as much in the body as on the stone. Consider this: a child watching an elder prepare pigment, grinding ochre, mixing it with spit, breathing it across their palm, then painting a deer, or a pattern, or a face. The child learns not through lecture, but through muscle, through imitation, through rhythm, and eventually they will make their own marks, repeating the ritual. In this way, art becomes lineage, not only of knowledge, but of touch, of breath. And in some cases, it becomes more than personal memory. It becomes communal. Rituals are often repeated acts, carried out not for novelty, but for renewal, to connect the living with the dead, the present with the eternal. In some cave systems, multiple generations returned over centuries to add new images. This continuity suggests the caves were more than canvases. They were spaces of return, of anchoring, each visit an act of remembrance, each stroke a reaffirmation. Even in the making, there is this echo of repetition. The same gestures, hand pressed to wall, pigment blown, torch raised, performed again and again, across time, across geography, across minds. And through this ritual, the image becomes more than a depiction. It becomes a presence. There's a term in art theory, indexicality. It refers to a mark that is physically caused by what it represents, like a footprint in mud or smoke from a fire. These cave paintings are indexical in the deepest sense. They are not just of something, they are from someone, from a breath, a hand, a time. Which brings us to the final sacred element, the breath itself. It is so easily overlooked, and yet it is the most intimate act of all. To create a hand stencil, one of the most iconic forms of cave art, the artist had to place their palm against the stone, purse their lips, and exhale pigment through a tube. They didn't draw the image, they exhaled it. Their lungs, diaphragm, and lips became tools of transformation. What they breathed out became visible. Their very life force, moist, coloured, shaped by intention, settled on the wall and stayed. In this way, breath was both medium and message, and that breath remains, trapped in particles embedded in pigments. Some scientists speculate that with advanced analysis, we may one day isolate human DNA from the remnants of that pigment cloud. But even without such technology, we already know what matters, that breath is human. It is shared. You, me, the Paleolithic painter, we all exhale stories. Some vanish in air, some linger on stone. The hand stencils then become a chorus of breathing bodies. They do not shout, they whisper, they do not claim, they witness. This is not a statement of ownership, but of presence. I was here, I saw, I remembered, I became. This brings a kind of closure to the journey of fire, pigment, and breath. We began in the practical, with ochre and charcoal, with bird bones and stone tools. We moved through process, grinding, blowing, tracing. We followed the physical, knees on stone, backs bent, hands pressed. And through it all, we discovered something else, that every step in this ancient artistic ritual points toward reverence. Reverence not just for the animal painted, or the wall adorned, but for the act of creation itself. In honouring the process, we begin to see what our ancestors may have seen, that creation is not an act of domination, but of dialogue. The artist listens as much as they act. They follow the curves of the cave, they wait for the right moment, they work with what the world gives them, ochre in the earth, shadow in the firelight, breath in the chest. To make art in a cave was to participate in a conversation older than language, a quiet agreement between matter and meaning, between flesh and stone. It is not surprising, then, that many cave paintings are found in places hard to reach, deep chambers, narrow tunnels, lightless alcoves. To arrive there, the artist had to crawl, to stoop, to trust the dark. And when they reached the wall, they brought with them not just pigment, but intention, perhaps even devotion. And so, in this dark cathedral of stone, lit by flicker and echo, the artist left behind more than images. They left behind presence, practice, prayer, not gods, not doctrines, just breath and pigment and fire. And a reminder that even in the harshest world there is time to create, to mark, to remember, to become more than survival, to become human. They did not leave in haste. There was no exodus, no stampede, no sudden reckoning. The silence that crept into the caves was not of fear or abandonment, but of transformation. One torch failed to return, one hand did not lift to the wall again. A generation passed, and then another. The firelight flickered one final time upon the painted stone, and then it did not return. What happens when the world itself begins to exhale, slowly, across millennia? When ice that had once buried continents begins to shudder, to melt, to yield its dominion back to the warming sun. Around 17,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum began to falter. Great ice sheets, once towering over the northern hemisphere, receded step by reluctant step. The climate shifted, not in a single gasp, but in slow breaths, in fits and starts, over generations too long for memory, but too brief for evolution. Forests crept northward, rivers swelled, seasons changed, and the world our ancestors had known began to vanish beneath their feet. How does a species adapt when the stage of its oldest rituals is taken from beneath it? The painted caves, those hushed stony sanctuaries of image and echo, were often tied to periglacial environments. The cold, harsh conditions above drove our ancestors below into the belly of the earth, where fire could guard against the eternal frost and art could whisper to the darkness. But as the Ice Age dissolved, so too did the conditions that had made the cave such a sacred container. What happens to a temple when its worshippers no longer need shelter? In this change, absence became a teacher. Not everything left behind is an offering. Some things are simply left. And yet, the vanishing of cave art from the archaeological record is not merely a disappearance, it is a turning of the page. Nearly all the major painted caves of Europe, from Chauvet to Lascaux to Altamira, saw their final acts unfold between 30,000 and 12,000 years ago. After that, the brushstroke fades from stone and the wall falls quiet. Was this the end of the artist, or the beginning of something new? One theory is practical. The caves were no longer needed for survival or ceremony. As the ice withdrew and the climate softened, humans spread out into new environments, following animals, chasing rivers, exploring open terrain. Mobility increased. So did exposure to light, to sky, to a world no longer sealed in white silence. Ritual may have simply followed the migration, outward, upward, into new symbolic landscapes. Another theory, more haunting, suggests cultural collapse, that the societies who once made these sacred images dissolved under ecological pressures or internal unravelling, and the knowledge to paint with such vision was lost. But perhaps instead, the mind evolved in concert with the thaw. If the caves were the dreaming minds of early humanity, might their abandonment signify not a loss, but a waking? What do we become when we emerge from the underworld? What remains when the ice is gone, but the memory of it lingers? In the soil, in the bones, in the breath of a changing wind, traces remain, not just of climate, but of culture. Because what vanished from the walls of caves did not vanish from the human mind. The impulse to mark, to symbolize, to make meaning, simply changed shape. It stretched its limbs in the sunlight, blinking, and found new surfaces to speak upon. We find them now in open-air sites, strange rock outcrops, cliff faces, and boulders scattered across the landscapes of post-glacial Europe and beyond. Here, in the open world, the language of form continued, not in the dense, echoing silence of the underworld, but under birdsong and sky. Petroglyphs, carvings instead of paintings, began to appear. Spirals, grids, lines of uncertain meaning. Images of animals, yes, but also of humans, standing, walking, sometimes even dancing. The palette was diminished, stripped of fire's flicker and the fine gradients of ochre, but the intention endured. The world had changed, but the desire to speak remained. Why the shift? Some suggest the change in technique. Carving instead of painting was pragmatic. In the open, pigment would fade quickly, washed by rain or worn by sun. A chiselled line, by contrast, could endure. But others argue this was more than adaptation. It was a new aesthetic, a new ritual form emerging from a new world. The Ice Age was not just a climate, it was a state of being. With its departure, a chapter of the human story closed. The next would be written in the wide light of the Holocene. Still, the silence of the abandoned caves haunts us. What does it mean for a tradition to end? Was it conscious, ceremonial? Did the last painter of Lascaux know they were the last? Or did they imagine others would come after them, descendants, apprentices, spirits yet unborn? In this, we see the vulnerability of culture, its impermanence, its dependency on continuity, on memory, on time, and yet, even endings can speak. The stillness of the cave after the flame goes out is not the same as before it was lit. The walls have changed, the pigment remains. The breath of those who knelt in reverence still clings to the air. When we enter these spaces now, carefully, reverently, we do not merely see art. We feel the residue of presence, the echo of ritual, the outline of a people who saw the world through fire and pigment and silence. In some caves, calcite has begun to reclaim the walls, covering paintings with shimmering curtains of mineral flow. The earth, it seems, is slowly drawing the curtain, not to erase but to enfold, to preserve as it always has in its own deep rhythms. The death of ice is also a return to water, a new cycle, and through this the human story does not stop, it only shifts course. As the glaciers retreated, our ancestors walked into new realms, where ice had once ruled and now rivers ran freely, where meadows bloomed in places once buried beneath permafrost. The animals changed, some vanished forever, like the woolly mammoth or the cave lion. Others, like the red deer or wild horse, adapted, migrating with the changing ecosystems. And the people changed too, not just in tools or clothing, but in how they made sense of the world around them. Without the caves, without the echoing womb of earth to shape experience, symbolism had to adapt. It did not disappear, it transformed. Where once the flicker of a torch revealed a galloping horse etched on a limestone wall, now the story might be told through a carved bone or painted pebble, through arrangements of stones in a field or symbols scratched into tree bark. The materials may have been humbler, less durable. Much of it may be lost to time, but the need to shape the invisible into visible form, remained. This moment in human history, around 10,000 years ago, marks not only the end of the Pleistocene but the dawn of a new epoch, the Holocene. The earth, freshly thawed, invited agriculture, settlement, and the first experiments in civilization. Symbolic life moved from the cave to the village, from the sacred hidden place to the shared communal space. One could argue that this marked the beginning of a more public art, a shift from mystery to message, from initiation to identity. And yet the echoes of the cave did not vanish entirely. At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a site over 11,000 years old, T-shaped megaliths stand in silent circles, carved with animals and abstract motifs. These were not shelters, they were monuments, gathering places built before the advent of cities, even before farming. Some scholars argue they were sites of ritual, perhaps even a continuation of the spiritual world once housed within caves. But now that world had risen to the surface. The landscape was different, but the spirit was recognizable. The images persisted: bulls, lions, birds of prey. Perhaps they were gods, or guardians, or ancestral beings. Perhaps they were memories, reminders of a time when humanity lived closer to the ice, to the hunt, to the brink of extinction. In the warming world, these images became a tether, an anchor to a fading past. What we witness in this period is not cultural decay, but metamorphosis, a rerouting of ancient impulses in new soils. The artistic silence of the caves is not a void, it is a pause, a pivot, a passage. From pigment to stone, from wall to sky, from shadow to sun, the art changed, because the world changed. And in that transformation, we begin to see something even deeper, that art is not a static achievement, but a living conversation between people and their place. The end of the Ice Age was not merely the vanishing of glaciers, it was the reshaping of everything familiar. Rivers carved new courses, forests rose where there had been tundra, and species migrated, evolved, or disappeared. The Earth recomposed itself, and in doing so, it asked humanity to respond. The response was not silence, it was adaptation. Even in the absence of caves, the symbolic mind found form. In Spain's Levant region, for instance, rock shelters became the new canvas. These shelters lacked the deep enclosures of earlier Paleolithic sites, but their overhanging ledges and sun-dappled walls offered new possibilities. The art that appeared here, what we now call Levantine rock art, is markedly different from that of Lascaux or Chauvet. It is more narrative, more social, hunting scenes, human figures in motion, groups dancing or gathering. A new kind of story was being told, not of gods hidden in the stone, but of people moving across the land. It reflects a shift not only in style but in worldview. Where earlier cave art invoked mystery and spirit through solitude and ritual, this new art spoke to collective life. It showed humans not as ghosts or fragments, but as active participants in an unfolding world. These changes mirrored broader transformations: sedentism, food cultivation, the first village communities. In a warming world, permanence became possible, and so too did new forms of memory. Art in this context was not just spiritual, It was social. A way to teach, to bond, to remember. Images became instructions: how to track an animal, how to plant a seed, how to live together. Perhaps even who you were. Identity itself may have found expression in new symbols, no longer hidden away in caverns, but painted openly where others could see. The sacred did not disappear, it simply wove itself into the ordinary. Still, the loss of cave art leaves a silence, not because it failed, but because it spoke in a language we're only beginning to remember. The sacred darkness of the Paleolithic caves was not replaced, it was transmuted. In the open-air sanctuaries, in the stone rings and burial mounds that followed, we can feel the echo, the awe, but no longer is it channeled through torchlight and breath on stone. Now it is filtered through sunlight and community, through ritual above ground. What does this tell us? That art is not defined by its medium, but by its meaning. And meaning is shaped by context, by climate, by survival, by spirit. The death of the Ice Age did not extinguish the human imagination. It gave it new terrain to explore. And in that terrain, across plains now thawed and coasts reshaped by meltwater, the memory of the cave flickered. No longer in charcoal shadows, but in the shared rituals of a warming species. We tend to imagine progress as a straight line, but history, especially deep history, moves in pulses. The artist of the Upper Paleolithic left no declarations, no signatures, no monuments of power. What they left were ghosts of gesture, stencils of hands, silhouettes of animals, pigment ground with purpose and blown through hollowed bone. These were not passive decorations, they were acts of devotion, moments of deep perception woven into stone. And yet, by the Holocene, many of these sacred galleries were sealed by time, sometimes literally, as with the landslides and sediment that preserved the Chauvet cave for over 30,000 years, sometimes metaphorically, as culture turned outward, toward the land and the sky, and away from the underworld of Earth's womb. What we are left with is not absence, but a shifting centre of gravity. The symbolic impulse remains unbroken, but the materials, the methods, and the metaphors evolve. In the Neolithic we see this vividly. The first pottery, adorned with simple patterns, figurines, now more abstract. Megaliths like those at Karnak and Stonehenge arranged with celestial precision. In these we find continuity, not of style, but of spirit. A sense that humans were still asking the same questions, still reaching beyond the visible, still painting not what they saw but what they felt. The death of Ice Age art was not a disappearance, but a reorientation, a turning of the face toward new mysteries. Even today the silence of the caves speaks. In their emptiness there is presence, in their darkness there is light. The figures left behind, those charging bison, those twisted antelope, those handprints lingering like faded breath, are not dead. They are paused, waiting. And in the act of looking at them, we resume a conversation so old it has no beginning. Perhaps this is the final lesson of their vanishing, that what matters most is not what survives, but what still speaks. The Ice Age ended, but the sacred did not. It merely stepped into a different light. And so, the artist walks on, no longer deep into the cave, but outward into the fields, across the rivers, beneath the stars. They leave their mark in earth and fire, in stone and song. And in doing so, they remind us that to be human is not merely to survive. It is to see, to shape, and to share. What the cave paintings began, the world now continues. They are not so different from us. That is the quiet revelation waiting within the dark contours of a handprint, or the curve of a reindeer etched in ochre. For so long these ancient artists were imagined as alien, primitive minds in a brutal world. But now, as you stand before the cave wall, breathing the same human breath into its silence, something shifts. The boundary dissolves. The echo's no longer distant. You're no longer a visitor to their world. You are of it. In the flicker of torchlight across limestone, the painted forms seem to stir. They are not frozen. They are mid-motion, horses galloping, bison leaping, mammoths thundering across a plain of stone. Yet it is not the movement that startles. It is the intent, a sense of composition, of style, of rhythm. These were not mere outlines of animals for reference or ritual. These were expressions, chosen lines, selected forms. They bear the fingerprint not of instinct, but of aesthetic decision. Who then was the audience? To create a story is to create a self, and this, perhaps, is the deepest mirror the caves hold up to us. These were not zoologists nor archivists of the hunt. They were not simply crafting tools or conveying territory. They were shaping narratives, layered, symbolic, deliberate. In this way, they were doing what we still do, building meaning into matter. Transforming pigment into presence. How does one explain the repeated spiral motifs, the nested dots, the abstract grids scrawled across walls from France to Indonesia? These are not depictions of prey. They are patterns. They are memory held in structure. It is in these designs that the line between art and cognition blurs entirely. For these spirals echo across time, in the Celtic stone, in Polynesian tattoos, in the labyrinths of Greek myth. The forms persist even as the languages perish. What ancient intuition were they tracing? Neuroscience offers a curious thread. Studies of visual cortex activity suggest that humans are predisposed to certain forms, curves over angles, symmetry over chaos, repetition over randomness. The cave artist, then, was not merely shaping the environment, they were also mapping the mind. What the viewer now witnesses is not a frozen scene, but a cognitive trace, a neuron's journey turned to ochre. Could it be that these artworks are not reflections of an outer world at all, but projections of an inner one? The question grows more intimate. If the art is a mirror, what does it show us? And more unsettling, what does it omit? The caves are filled with animals, with signs, with hands, but mirrors must also show faces, and these are rare. The human form, when it appears, is fragmented, reduced to phalluses, stick limbs, mask-like heads. What were they hiding from? Or perhaps, what were they trying to become? Art is not only a record of seeing, it is a record of being seen. And here, in the depths of the earth, something stirs that feels like shame, or reverence, or transformation. The painter is not looking outward. They are turning inward. In this moment, you, the viewer, are not watching them work. You're watching them watch themselves. And in that recursive loop, something remarkable occurs. Recognition. We find ourselves not just observers of ancient art, but participants in a psychological lineage stretching back tens of thousands of years. We do not simply inherit the artifacts of their creativity, we inherit the structure of mind that made them possible. Neuroscientists refer to this as cognitive continuity, the notion that while our technologies and societies have evolved, the architecture of human thought remains strikingly familiar. The brain that mixed ochre with fat and blew it across a hand stencil is, in most structural ways, your own. The same neural systems that handle metaphor, narrative, and imagination were already in play. Mirror neurons, responsible for empathy and mimicry, flickered with life as an early human watched another draw a line on stone. Prefrontal networks churned with pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and the slow unspooling of symbolic thought. Art was not an add-on to survival, it was a companion to it, a tool for meaning-making and memory in a chaotic world. And meaning, always, is personal. This is perhaps the final veil the cave removes. These works are not just cultural expressions, they are emotional ones. The trembling outlines of animals, the clusters of dots, the repetitions, they may reflect ritual or myth, but they also whisper of grief, joy, awe, and fear. A child's handprint among those of adults, a bison outlined but never filled, a mammoth drawn again and again, always in motion. These are not static icons. They are psychological impressions, just as abstract and resonant as any poem or photograph. We often speak of primitive art with the voice of distance, as if modernity has outrun its ancestors in complexity. But this is an illusion. Complexity is not linear. The minds that painted Chauvet, Lascaux, or Rhinos were not climbing toward modernity. They were already navigating the vast interior landscape of human consciousness. The difference is only in tools, not in depth. Their brush was made of reed and breath, ours of pixels and code. But the gesture is the same. To stare at a cave painting is to encounter a choice. You can view it as artifact, dusty, academic, a relic. Or you can allow it to become a mirror, not of the past, but of the self. It is in that choice that the artwork lives or dies. for it is not pigment that gives it breath. It is attention, it is interpretation, and it is wonder. The figures on the wall do not ask for explanation, they ask for empathy. They ask us not what we know, but how we feel. And in that silent exchange, they remain eternally alive. Art is often seen as a product, an object to be analysed, bought, sold, or archived. But in the caves, art is not a product. It is a process. It is the outcome of sustained attention, applied to an inner vision, translated through gesture. In this sense, the Paleolithic painter was not unlike the modern novelist, composer, or filmmaker. The medium changes, but the motive remains, to externalise the ineffable, to give shape to the unseen. This deep continuity between ancient and modern minds can be felt most clearly in our stories. For as long as we have painted, we have told tales, not always with words, but with form, repetition, rhythm. On one wall, a sequence of animals gallop as if through time. On another, a hybrid creature, half man, half beast, stands as a guardian or trickster. These are not zoological records, they are narrative fragments, visual myths, and their structure echoes the timeless arc of storytelling that still governs our films and books today. Modern neuroscience suggests that this narrative tendency is not a cultural invention, but a neurological one. The human brain is wired to find causality, to link events, to shape chaos into coherence. Our memories are stories, our identities are stories. The Paleolithic artist may not have written novels, but they understood the power of sequence and suggestion. 3 antelope painted in succession is not just a group, it is motion, it is pursuit, it is time itself. We must also consider what these stories excluded. As we saw in earlier chapters, the human figure is notably scarce in cave art. Instead, identity is refracted through animal forms, through abstract symbols, or through the void itself. This absence is not a lack, but a strategy. It speaks to a worldview where self is porous, where spirit is not bound by skin. In modern terms, this might resemble metaphor or personification. In cave art, it is something deeper, an ontological fluidity, where the line between human and animal self and other is intentionally blurred. And yet, through all of this, we recognise ourselves. In the layering of images, in the use of light and shadow, in the recursive hand that marks its own presence. We are not decoding a foreign tongue, we are overhearing a familiar voice echoing backward through millennia. A voice that tells us, I saw this, I felt this, I needed you to know. In this way, Paleolithic art is not a fossil, it is a message in a bottle, cast across an ocean of time, and when we receive it, not just intellectually, but emotionally, we do not merely understand the past, we meet it. We meet the mind that imagined, the hand that painted, the breath that blew pigment through hollow reed, and in that meeting we see ourselves again. This realization transforms the cave wall into something more than a canvas. It becomes a threshold, a crossing point between the ancient and the now, the known and the unknowable. The artists who crouch beneath flickering firelight are no longer abstractions, they are kin. They are predecessors not just of our biology, but of our minds, our dreams, our longing to be seen. They made their marks not simply to record the world, but to reflect it back to themselves and to us. In the modern world, we are surrounded by images. Screens flicker with 1,000 moving parts, symbols flood our vision, art is everywhere, and yet rarely do we pause to ask what it truly means to make an image, to transform thought into form. This, at its essence, is what those early painters did. They didn't just replicate, they reimagined. The bison in the cave is not merely a bison, it is an idea of a bison, a memory, a spirit, perhaps a fear, perhaps a prayer. This act of reimagining, of translating the invisible into the visible, is what connects them to us. It is what all art aspires to do, to pull from the interior and place it in the world, to turn silence into symbol. And this too is what neuroscience helps us understand. The act of creating art activates the same brain regions involved in introspection, memory, and empathy. It is not just a motor task, it is an emotional and conceptual one. It is, neurologically, a form of self-revelation. When a child draws a picture of a monster, They are not merely copying an image, they are externalizing a feeling, a worry, a question. When a Paleolithic artist paints a wounded deer or a charging horse, we must ask, is this a hunt remembered or a wish imagined? Is it hope, grief, awe, or something we no longer have words for? In this ambiguity lies the power of cave art. It does not dictate meaning, it invites it. It is open-ended in a way modern media rarely dares to be. Its silence is its eloquence. Its absence of explanation allows space for our own interior responses to rise. And so, in contemplating it, we are not just learning about ancient humans, we are experiencing what they themselves may have felt. Not certainty, but wonder. Not knowledge, but mystery. Perhaps that is the greatest gift they left us. The opportunity not to know, but to feel. To stand in darkness beneath stone ceilings and be overwhelmed not by answers, but by questions that reach through time. Questions that stir something quiet and old inside us. A flicker of recognition, a ripple of continuity. We are not looking at the beginning of art. We are looking at a mirror, held steady by hands long vanished. And in that mirror we are invited not only to see, but to be seen. This is the quiet revolution of the caves. They do not speak, yet they recognize. Their painted walls do not teach by instruction, but by resonance. There is no doctrine here, no dogma. Only the breath of meaning passed from one mind to another across thousands of years, unbroken by language, unspoiled by time. What this mirror reflects is not always comfortable. It shows us a humanity both alien and familiar, capable of wild imagination and deep restraint, of beauty conjured from darkness. It reminds us that consciousness did not begin in modernity, nor in cities or schools. It began here, in the hush of torchlit galleries, where pigment met stone and thought became shape. It reflects the burden and gift of memory, the fact that humans, uniquely, do not just experience life, they remember it, anticipate it, reimagine it. We carry time within us, and from that temporal burden comes art, the need to record, the ache to express, the impulse to turn experience into symbol, and symbol into connection. The ancient painters did not know us. They did not paint for history books or museums, but perhaps they painted for the same reason we still write and speak and draw today. To reach beyond the self, to leave something behind, to say, I was here, I saw, I felt, and to hope, quietly, that someone would someday listen. Now it is our turn to listen, to receive the echo, not just to study it, but to feel its weight, to understand that when we gaze at the handprints in El Castillo or the lions of Chauvet, we are not gazing into a past that is dead, but into a presence that still lives. It lives in us, in our urge to create, in our stories, in our silences, in every moment when we look at the world and try to understand not only what it is, but what it means. This continuity is not simply biological, it is psychological, emotional, spiritual. It is the river of shared interiority that flows beneath the surface of millennia, shaping minds and dreams alike. And so, the mirror endures, not as glass but as stone, not as reflection but as continuity. In those painted chambers we do not find answers, we find ourselves. The journey, which began in mystery and wonder, now reaches its revelation, that the ancient and the modern are not separate species of mind, but the same flame passed from torch to torch, a lineage of breath and pigment, of story and silence. And though the caves may fall into ruin and the paint may fade, the impulse remains, to make meaning, to be known, to reach across darkness and touch, to remember that the first artists were not trying to be eternal, they were simply trying to be understood. And in understanding them, we understand something eternal in ourselves. They were not forgotten, they were not primitive, they were not mute. The first painters, those quiet figures who walked into the silence of stone with pigment and fire, were something far stranger and more familiar, us. We have called them hunter-gatherers, toolmakers, nomads. But the flicker of a torch against the swelling contours of a cave wall suggests another title, one that echoes far deeper, philosopher. As the final embers of the Ice Age dimmed, and as continents shifted beneath their feet, these early humans turned inward, not merely to survive but to contemplate. They asked questions of the dark and answered them in lines and silhouettes. What kind of mind looks into the void and chooses to leave behind the trace of a thought, a feeling, a soul, a deer poised in motion, a hand reaching from the rock, a bison exhaling the breath of the earth itself? These were not adornments, they were meditations, not decorations of space, but inscriptions of mind. In the cradles of Chauvet and Altamira, of Sulawesi and El Castillo, we find more than pigment, we find intention. That is the radical truth that emerges, slowly and without apology, from these painted tombs of time. The human need to create is not an accident of evolution. It is a condition of being. So how do we return to them, not as archaeologists, but as descendants? What happens when the viewer is no longer a tourist in the past, but a participant in its unfolding memory? For decades, we approached these artworks as puzzles to be solved. We measured carbon, mapped stylistic patterns, debated functional theories. But beneath the questions of how and when, another inquiry was always murmuring, why? Why paint what cannot be eaten? Why reach into darkness to birth images that no one may see again? Why transform stone into story? Perhaps the answer lies not in what was painted, but in the very act of painting itself. The first artists were witnesses to forces too vast for words, ice that groaned across continents, herds that thundered like living rivers, skies that changed without warning. In the face of such chaos, to leave a mark, to fix even a fleeting image, was a declaration, not of control, but of reverence, not of knowledge, but of wonder. In this, the artist becomes not a recorder, but a mirror. The wall does not just hold the animal, it holds the gaze that beheld the animal, it reflects a consciousness, alive and unfinished. And so, in a world without cities or books, without metal or myth as we know it, a few wandered into caverns and wrote the first silent sentences of the human story, not with grammar, but with gesture, not with sound, but with shadow. What do we owe to them, these ancestral dreamers of stone and breath? And more haunting still, what might they have seen in us? Perhaps not strangers, but echoes, not gods nor descendants they could name, but kin of the same mystery. For though millennia separate our lives, something ancient remains unbroken. The handprint on a wall, made with ochre and breath, is not a message sealed in time, it is a mirror reaching across it. The first painters may not have known we would come, may not have painted for us, but they painted as us. They moved through the world with the same yearning to make sense of it, to capture beauty before it vanished, to translate the unspoken into form. And yet the whisper persists. Why? Why did this impulse emerge in darkness, in danger, under bone-chilling stone? Why spend hours grinding ochre when there was hunger to stave off and fire to maintain? We return to the question not to solve it, but to dwell in its shadow. Every theory we conjure, ritual magic, social cohesion, mnemonic memory, is an attempt to scaffold mystery with logic. But mystery resists scaffolding. It does not collapse under scrutiny. It deepens. To stand before a Paleolithic bison, charging across the undulations of a stone wall, is not to decipher a code. It is to stand beside a fellow human who once knelt there, eyes flickering with torchlight, heart beating with purpose. The act of painting was likely more than performance. It was an encounter between self and other, between known and unknowable, between life and whatever breathes beyond it. Consider again the animals. They are not static. They move. They shiver with motion. Some appear in overlapping forms, one drawn upon another like memory itself replaying. Some seem half emerged from the rock, as though the cave itself is dreaming. Was this deliberate? Likely. Was it sacred? Possibly. But sacredness, in its deepest form, is not bound to religion. It is an attention so complete, so reverent, that the boundary between world and mind dissolves. The first painters did not own the animals they drew. They honoured them. There is a humility in this art that belies the power it took to make it. No signatures, no portraits of leaders or emblems of conquest, no narrative of domination. Instead, connection. Presence. The interweaving of hunter and hunted, dreamer and dreamed. In this sense, the caves are not tombs, they are thresholds. To paint an animal was perhaps to cross into it, to feel its breath from the inside, to lose the boundary of human skin, and imagine another form of being. And so we must ask, were these the first artists or the first philosophers? The difference may be illusion. In the beginning, thought did not divide itself. Art and meaning, myth and memory, survival and song, all flowed together in one stream. The first painters did not sit atop a hierarchy of knowledge. They were submerged in it. They painted not to rise above the world, but to fall more deeply into it. And in that descent they revealed something elemental, perhaps the most enduring aspect of our species, the desire not merely to live, but to express living. Not only to observe, but to transmute observation into symbol. That act of turning breath into pigment, gesture into mark, is the same alchemy that fuels poetry, music, science, and memory. These first painters were not beginning a tradition of art. They were revealing that the tradition had already begun in the very folds of consciousness. Even today, when we run our fingers across the grooves of a carved tusk, or stare into the shadowed contours of a painted cavern wall, we feel it, the continuity of attention. They looked closely. So do we. They felt something stir within, unnameable yet urgent. So do we. Though the tools have changed, from ochre and stone to stylus and screen, the impulse has not. We still seek to reach across time and space with a mark that says, I saw, I felt, I was here. And perhaps the most startling realization is that, in looking at their art, we do not merely study them, they study us. The animals on the walls turn their heads. The handprints seem to linger. These images made in flickering firelight seem to see. They are not relics of a primitive mind. They are dialogues, unfinished and ongoing. In this way, the art of the first painters transcends category. It is not archaeology. It is not myth. It is presence. There is something profoundly modern in their abstraction, in the fragmented way they hinted rather than declared. The human form, rarely shown, is often distorted, masked, composite, animalian. The viewer must fill in the rest. This artistic restraint invites empathy. It leaves space. It asks a question rather than offering an answer. In a world inundated with images that scream for attention, Paleolithic art whispers. It invites stillness, reflection, contemplation. And in that quiet, we come to understand they were not so different. They loved. They feared. They wondered. They were not decorating their caves. They were mapping their minds. And in doing so, they handed us a mirror. For all our technologies, we remain uncertain why we create. We can measure brain waves and decode pigments, but the origin of beauty, the reason we ache to shape sound, line, colour, is beyond data. The first painters remind us that not everything meaningful must be explained. Some truths are not meant to be dissected, but witnessed, held, shared in silence, and so the caves endure, not as fossils, but as frequencies, vibrations of human presence etched into stone. To enter them is not to travel backward, but inward. The past is not behind us, it's beneath us, breathing through the bedrock. The first painters did not vanish. They echo. They persist in every child who draws, in every hand that shapes, in every soul that looks at the world and says, "Let me show you." That simple, profound impulse, so ancient and yet so immediate, may be the truest thread linking us to those who knelt in torchlight and pressed their palms against damp stone. The gesture is not about mastery. It is not about ego. It is about connection, and perhaps above all about care. To show is to share. To paint is to pass something on. In those forgotten galleries of the earth surrounded by echoes and flickers, the first painters were not merely illustrating their world, they were offering something of themselves to the future. To us, not out of vanity but out of a quiet, burning need, that someone, someday, might see what they saw, might feel what they felt. There is a humility in that act and a grandeur too. It suggests that meaning, once born, must be carried forward, that memory matters even when words do not exist. The walls of Chauvet, of Sulawesi, of Altamira are not journals. They are not narratives. They are vessels of awareness. Their shapes, their silence, their shadows, They ask us to slow down, to inhabit time not as a straight line but as a spiral. The painter's breath may be gone, but their attention remains, and in a strange and tender way, their attention becomes ours. When we look at the great horses galloping across limestone or the negative handprints floating in red dust, we don't just see evidence, we feel presence. We begin to understand that art is not about aesthetics, it is about witnessing. A handprint is a paradox, anonymous yet intimate. It says, "This was me," and yet offers no name, no face, only the outline of touch, and that may be the purest form of art we know, a signature without identity, a declaration without selfhood. It trusts that meaning does not require explanation. What we inherit from these ancient marks is not technique, but tenderness, not information, but a way of being in the world, a way of noticing. They painted not because they had to, but because they could, because they discovered within themselves something irreducible, something that asked to be offered, and we, centuries and centuries later, still receive it. That continuity is not just historical, it is emotional. It reminds us that we do not need to fully understand our ancestors in order to feel their presence. The first painters are not trapped in the past. They are here, in the rhythm of our fingers, in the ache of our longing to make meaning. In every artist who wonders if their work matters, if their marks will last, if their voice will carry. It will. It always has. The caves whisper. Not everything vanishes. And as we listen, we realise the echo is not behind us, it's within us. We are no longer visitors peering into the past through glass panels and electric light. We are no longer tourists of time, marvelling at the strange and ancient. We are participants in the same old rhythm, shaped by the same questions, stirred by the same need to leave a trace. The first painters did not vanish. They became us. What began as a shadow on stone, an antelope, a spiralling dot, a hand, has spiralled outward into cathedrals and novels, lullabies and dances, rituals and myths. From ochre on limestone to pixels on a screen, the materials have changed, but the motion has not. To mark, to mean, to reach beyond the present moment with a trembling kind of hope. In this, art is not decoration. It is continuity, a dialogue that has never ended. When we ask, why did they paint? We're also asking, why do we? And the answers are not separate. They live in the same cave. Perhaps they painted to speak to spirits, or to hunt with better fortune. Perhaps they painted to mark a coming of age, or to remember the fallen. But perhaps they painted for the same reason we still do, to understand themselves. To say, I was here, I saw this, I felt this. That is not survival. That is something else entirely, something rarer. Consciousness, yes, but also conscience. A reaching outward not just to record the world, but to reflect it, question it, sanctify it. The first painters were not merely surviving the world, they were reflecting upon it, responding to it, shaping it. And through that, they were shaping themselves. We will never know their names, we will never know what they feared, what they hoped for, what laughter sounded like beside the flicker of a torch. But we do know this. They looked at a blank wall in the deep dark and saw the possibility of meaning, and they chose to act on it. That choice, made again and again by countless hands in countless caves, is still available to us. Not in limestone, perhaps, but in whatever surfaces we dare to touch. Canvas, paper, code, movement, language. Our world may be brighter, faster, louder, but the whisper remains the same. Make something. Leave a mark, let someone see. The journey we've taken into the caves was never just about the past. It was always about returning home, carrying with us not only the memory of ancient art, but the recognition that we too are part of this long unfinished gesture. So, when the light dims and silence gathers again, listen closely. The stone may seem still, but it is not empty. There, in the quiet, the first painters still breathe, and so do we. Thank you, fellow Sapien, for walking this long road through the echoes of stone and fire, and for joining me in tracing the fingerprints of our ancestors, still pressed gently into the cave walls of time. If this story brought you a moment of quiet wonder, helped you feel a little more connected to the deep past, or offered a new way to see your own creative spark, then I'm grateful for your presence here. I wonder, was there an image that stayed with you? A single curve of ochre, a whisper in the dark, a glimmer of recognition in a painted eye. Whether it was the image of a mammoth flickering in torchlight, the hush of breath blown through a reed to leave a crimson handprint, or the fading rhythm of footfalls vanishing as the ice retreated, these fragments are what connect us, not just to them, but to each other. If one of these moments spoke to you, I invite you to leave a reflection in the comments, as a quiet offering, a thread in the tapestry of thought we're weaving together here. And if you'd like to keep walking with us into deeper histories, stranger stories, and quieter truths, feel free to like, share, or subscribe. There's always another cave ahead, waiting to be entered. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful,